And then this is the kind of noob trap setup killer. If we try. All right, you guys know how I got that new microphone? I forgot to set that up on my other display setting, so give me like 2 minutes to fix that, and then we can start this stream in earnest. All right, mic check. Okay, now we should be good. Didn't take 2 minutes. I just copied and pasted a setting. I should have duplicated it, but I'll need to remember to go back and fix that next time. So anyway, sorry for the little technical difficulty, the technical being me. So anyway, welcome back to another stream, everybody. As you guys may have been following along, I have recently completed my playthrough of Lies of P. Oh, wait, nope. Cut it out. Sorry, dog. Yeah, so we finished the playthrough of Lies of P last night, and rather than just going like straight back into Elden Ring lore videos and stuff, I thought it'd be cool to explore some of the meta-analysis of Lies of P. So today I wanted to look at some other people's reviews of the game just to see how much in common other people's feelings were, or how do I phrase that? I wanted to see how much in common my feelings were with other people's feelings of the game. So today I have queued up for the stream Lies of P review after 100% by Mortismal Gaming. And I meant to look at his 100% of Lords of the Fallen review, which I failed to do. I think his 100% video came out like a couple days before mine or something like that. So he definitely went through Lies of P a lot more than I did, so I'm curious to see if the 100% like affects the review or anything like that. And then after that, I thought we could look at Pinocchio, A Story About Art and God by Jacob Geller. This was a video that was very often recommended to me throughout my playthrough of Lies of P, so
figured this would be a good time to check it out on stream. And then depending on how much time we have after these two videos, I have Lies of P is the best Souls-like if you like to lose by Ratatoskr. And Ratatoskr is a bit of a negative Nancy, so I thought it'd be fun to hear his perspective on Lies of P, because he and I did have differing feelings on Lords of the Fallen, so I'm very curious to see what his take was on this game. And then, like I said before, depending on time, yeah, it's that good. Mixed reviews, Lies of P by Maximilian Dude. So that's kind of what's on tap for tonight. So welcome back to stream, everybody. Asinex, Mortismal, nice to see both of you guys again. Hilko, welcome to the stream. I don't believe I've seen you before. Scallies, nice to see you. Yeah, no more time to lie. I'm going to check out the New Game Plus changes LOP has. It's only one major one, but you want to know what I think? Maybe, maybe not, because I am trying to work on getting another script out for Elden Ring lore. And that's kind of consuming a bit of my time. So between writing the script, gathering the footage for it, and then also trying to edit it, I want to get that process all done and complete before the Final Fantasy VII Remake Rebirth episode gets released. And, or, you know, the anniversary of Elden Ring. It's about the same timeline there. So I feel like I'm probably going to be a bit too busy to juggle adding that stuff as well as the stream, but we'll see. And Dr. N, welcome back to stream. There's two changes? Okay, so this is one of your favorite Geller videos. I don't think I've watched anything by him before, so. Okay, let's go ahead and dive on into our first video of the night with Lies of P review after 100%. Also, I'm just curious, since I got that new mic, can you guys hear my dog squeaking the squeaker toy? He's not doing it the second, but right now he is. Because if you can't, that'd be pretty crazy. But he's feeling feisty. Putting the toy in my lap. Okay. All right. Lies of P review after 100% by Mortismal Gaming. Okay, you can hear it.
What?
All right. Hey, Boxer Wing, welcome back in. You can definitely hear the pepper. My fault. I'll probably start muting myself in between, like, the people talking then. Okay. Here we go. Mortismal Gaming.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Lies of P, a recent Souls-like from developer REVEWS that sees us taking on the role of Pinocchio, essentially, in a dark and gritty imagining of that fable, which is certainly an interesting premise. Though, before we get into that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, it's linked in the description below, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. On that note though, I'm able to bring you this video slightly ahead of the game's official release, though it is in its early access period right now, due to a review copy that I got sent on September 11th, alongside a press mailer to go with it. Though it's worth.
So I'm not going to like throw shade at him, but I am kind of annoyed that this is just kind of a somewhat common practice in gaming in general. And I will also admit that I would be a total hypocrite and accept an early review code. I mean, I already have done that for a game with Hunt the Night. But yeah, I just really wish that the review codes or like the reviews were more organic and followed after the release, so that way people could get a kind of more accurate read on the situation of the game, because quite often I feel like a lot of early reviews kind of sway public opinion one way or another, and I feel like many of them end up being a little bit too early with their praises, and many can't dig deep enough to really understand the depth of certain games. I don't necessarily want to say flaws, but maybe like shortcomings might be a better term there. So I will definitely give not Max, Mortismal Gaming kudos for actually 100%ing the game, because I feel like while you don't necessarily need 100% a game, it definitely gives you a much broader depth of perspective than many other reviewers do after like a 4 to 6 hour review, you know? It's like barely anything. If I only played Lies of P between like the first 10 hours, I wouldn't have probably run into those wall bosses that felt a bit more out of place. And I was talking about this with Mortismal, a different person than Mortismal Gaming, on the Discord earlier today or like last night after stream, that the bosses I felt got more difficult. They were kind of more akin to what I would say like Margit was in Elden Ring, where they weren't impossible by any means, but they just kind of felt out of place in comparison to like a lot of the normal style enemies in certain areas and locations. Scaleezy has one of the top comments in Jacob Geller's Pinocchio video. Okay, maybe we'll look at it. Dr. N said, did I play unpatched or patched, by the way? So it was patched, I think 1.004, probably like the most recent one, as of 2 weeks ago. So like I keep my PS5 off because I don't want my Elden Ring game to update past 1.0 right now. So unless they came out with a patch within the last 2 weeks to change things even further, it's probably the most recent one. Oh, you guys are getting hiccups through the mic? So I wonder if my dog squeaking his toy was causing my noise gate to go through. Okay. Yeah, and like I don't necessarily hate the reviewers for trying to like get the reviews done, because as Mortis says, they are under an intense like pressure schedule, and I just kind of hate the game, not so much the players. Dr. N says, very few players, both in favor and against Lies of P, manage to fully experiment and try all the game could offer, often offering simplistic opinions from what you've seen. Yeah, and I wouldn't even say that I could offer like a full opinion, because I only use a fairly small subsect of weapons, or at least weapon handles. And yeah. I also felt as though I was just having some issues in general, which I suspect are me, but I would be vindicated if other people were having similar issues as I was. Okay, so let's go back to the video now.
Worth mentioning, the embargo for this title was actually a few days ago when I put up my first impressions video, and we'll circle back to that in a second. In the meantime, Lies of P, as I said, puts us in the role of a puppet awakened by a mysterious voice to handle some problems plaguing the island of Krat. Krat is beset by murderous puppets who went into a frenzy and attacked everyone, which happened on top of a plague that was sweeping the island known as the petrification disease. Our job is to step in and deal with this, or at the very least attempt to, in classic Souls-like combat, though the game does do a few unique and interesting things that I think are noteworthy, alongside a few areas that could definitely use some improvement in my opinion. Now, before we dive into all of that fully, I like to start videos for newer titles with a comment on the technical state of that game, as these days how a game runs, especially at launch, is a pretty important topic of discussion.
Yeah, and this is one of those things which I find is kind of awkward to talk about, because this is quite often like a time capsule of when a game is released or when it's reviewed. Whereas like generally I like to give developers the benefit of the doubt, but to be fair, I also haven't really played like a lot of games and reviewed them on my channel at a time where like the technical side of things was an issue. But yeah, at the very least, I do appreciate the kind of disclaimer here, because, yeah, a lot of games don't release in the best of states now, do they? It happens when I'm just talking. Okay, I'll try to keep an eye on that. So, yeah, if the gain is too high, I could probably adjust that. So thanks for letting me know. I appreciate that.
On one hand, the game ran pretty flawlessly for me. I have a very high-end PC. I'll try to put the specs in the description below if you're curious. If I forget, they're on the channel's About page as well, but I didn't really run into any bugs. The game didn't crash. The only problem I really had is that sometimes the camera was less than helpful, especially if you got pushed into a corner or something, and every once in a while a hitbox would seem, frankly, just a little bit off. but that was pretty rare. However, I think something important to note in the technical section of this video is that a couple of days before the launch of the game and after the review embargoes lifted, NeoWiz added Denuvo to the game, which is a third-party software that is meant to keep people from tampering with it. So a few things on that specifically. For me, Denuvo has never really been a big deal. There are some very credible reports that it will affect various games' performance, and in general, third-party DRM is pretty annoying, but I will admit it is not something that has ever factored into my own decision-making when it comes to buying a game. That said, what I don't like about this is that the fact that they slipped it in after the reviews and embargoes lifted and everything, and I'm definitely not a fan of that approach or the decision-making there, especially since
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair criticism, because if you think you're getting one thing, and even if it's just changed slightly, that can, just be enough to raise a little bit of alarm.
I just told you how this game ran for me, and combined with that already being a difficult metric to provide thanks to the large variety of hardware configurations, it's made that much more difficult because now I don't know if a problem was specifically caused by Denuvo after the fact, and it muddies waters that didn't need to be muddy, frankly. But as for how you feel about that, you're going to have to decide for yourself, but for now, let's talk about the rest of the game. Starting with a little note on the difficulty. This is a Soulslike, which is a genre that is known for being challenging, and Lies of P is certainly no exception. I will say this game in particular relies pretty heavily on blocking and parrying, or guard as it calls it, and timing that out perfectly, or close to perfectly I should say. You'll likely still be able to beat it even if you're not great at it, because I admit I'm honestly no paragon of that particular metric, but your life will be a lot easier if that is a system you can manage to learn and employ effectively. However, most of the non-boss enemies, that's not really an issue. You can mostly just kill them by blocking their attacks in general. And to make this a little easier for people who are having trouble, just about all of the major bosses, though not literally all of them, have a specter available to help you in the boss fight. That is to say, a summonable minion of sorts that can distract the boss and attack it, which will allow you to focus on dealing damage and less on the blocking outside of just generally getting out of the way. And
I kind of forgot that specters are a thing because I am a stubborn person who likes to defeat them all directly myself. So yeah, I guess that would have made a lot of the bosses easier, especially the ones I felt a bit more out of place. And maybe I should have utilized that, but that's generally not how I like to go through the games myself. So yeah, I think that's good to keep in mind. And on a side note, I did lower down the innate gain on my microphone, and I kind of bumped it up on like the OBS side of things. So let me know if it's still cutting out, and I might be able to adjust it a bit further, because it does kind of look like my voice is going into the red. So it might need a little more adjustment.
what's more, a little later into the game, you can get an item called a Wish Stone, which is a customizable consumable that will allow you to either buff yourself or the Spectre in specific boss fights, which can make up for its somewhat at times woeful AI, honestly. So in terms of difficulty, yes, it's a Souls-like. If you're not a fan of that type of game or that type of challenge, this one isn't going to be what changes your mind, but I do think it was manageable. From there, let's talk a little bit about the story of Lies of P, as it is pretty interesting. As I mentioned earlier, we play as a puppet who wakes up on a train at the behest of a mysterious voice that would essentially like us to deal with the puppet frenzy and the plague on the island. Unsurprisingly, this sets us on a grand adventure of sorts where we need to deal with all these problems, which brings us into contact with all sorts of monstrosities caused by both the plague and the puppet frenzy. However, what makes the story particularly interesting is that, much like the story of Pinocchio, it involves lying or telling the truth. There are many situations where you can choose to either lie about something or tell the truth about it, and choosing to do so or not do so can lead you up to 3 potential endings. Now, honestly, regardless of what you choose during the playthrough, there isn't a whole lot that will change. In a few cases, you'll get a different reward than you would have otherwise, but most of what changes here is the ending, as the game itself is relatively linear. We'll get into that more in the gameplay section, but for the most part, it's straightforward. There's not a lot of exploration outside of where you're supposed to be or doing things out of order, etc. After you beat the story, however, there is a New Game Plus mode available, which you can do to either see the endings or just continue grinding away and working at the challenge, etc., whatever floats your boat there. And in fact, outside of just the endings and things like that, there is at least one achievement, which is collecting all of the records in the game, which are soundtracks you can play in the hub area, requires you to New Game Plus. You won't be able to do that without doing so. Overall, however, I would...
This isn't really important, but it kind of surprises me when people show like the end game areas in the review footage. Not that it like really matters to most extents, because like most people aren't going to really remember this little random mob on the ledge, but I don't know. When I like to release reviews, I try to keep a lot of my footage is in like the early areas as possible, just to try to not have things be spoilered. But I guess to be fair, when you have a review that says review after 100%, you might expect some more spoiler type stuff. So yeah, okay.
Say I enjoyed the story. It was surprisingly in-depth. It was much more than I was expecting it to be. It was an interesting narrative. They do a good job of throwing you hints and clues about stuff that's going on via notes, etc., and just actual dialogue with characters that pops up. And if you're paying attention and actually reading everything, I think the story is there and pretty coherent, which for a Souls-like is somewhat of a rarity. Moving on from there, however, let's talk about some progression systems. So we're always going to be playing the same character. However, what will change here is how we build said character. Starting with leveling up and stat increases. As we kill enemies, we will be gaining ergo, which is our experience and currency, as it is with most Souls-likes, and we can spend this to level up. Each level up allows us to enhance one of our 6 stats. When we first start the game, we can pick from 3 presets that will give us a good starting point. This is hardly final, and you can customize it from here however you want. But we can increase 1 of 6 stats. 3 of these are important for basically everybody. Vitality, vigor, and capacity, as these are going to affect our health, stamina, and weight, as we don't want to have too much equipped or it will slow us down and thus make us easy to kill, and you also need enough stamina and health to actually get through a fight. The other 3 stats, however, are our damage stats. Many weapons and things scale off of particular stats and will deal more damage based on what you have in those. So in that regard, you want to raise the damage stat you are actually using the most. However, that gets really interesting when you start taking a look at the weapons of the game, because the other big part of progression is, of course, our equipment. The most interesting of which is easily weapons, as this will, of course, define our playstyle a little bit and the way we attack enemies. There are all sorts of them. There are both normal and special weapons, each of which has their own special attacks, etc. But the interesting thing about weapons is that for the normal weapons in the game, it is actually a weapon and a handle that you are picking up. And a short ways into the game, you'll be able to assemble weapons, that is to say, customize both the handle and the blade of a weapon. Now you can...
So I'm a little bit surprised he didn't mention that the stats of the first weapon you pick kind of carry over for when you're respeccing. So that's not the biggest of deals, but it definitely surprised me. And maybe having like the extra 6 points for dexterity or whatnot that I missed out of from like switching motivity to dexterity could have like made me defeat some bosses a bit more easily towards the end there. But it was just kind of unexpected since, I don't know, I just didn't really expect it. And then I do want to talk about the crafting stuff, but he might have more to say about it. So I'll just pick it up maybe after he finishes his point. Scalise said, humanity level mostly affects small things like how twitchy or robotic you are, how long the shadow of your nose is, and how the cat treats you. It doesn't really matter until the decision with Sophia. Okay. So maybe he'll talk about that in the review. So your humanity level matters with Sophia, or is it just the choice that you make with or for her?
Upgrade weapons with various materials you'll find, and this will affect the blade of the weapon. However, in changing the handle, you can actually change the stats and the way a weapon swings by putting a particular handle on it. This allows you to effectively make any weapon scale off of the stat you want, while at the same time making sure that it swings and moves in a way that is ideal to you. Personally, I love that system. It's probably the coolest thing about this game for me, as that is a really interesting idea in a Souls-like that I enjoyed a great deal. It offers a ton ton of customization to the weapons beyond what would normally be there. However, the blades themselves determine the special attack of the weapon, which we'll get into a bit later, and overall it's just really cool. Beyond weapons, however, there are other...
So he says they'll get into it later, but I'm not sure if he's going to talk about things quite the same way that I went to right now. So while I was a really big fan of that idea of having the blades separated from the handles and the handles kind of determining the moveset, I was a little bit disappointed with how the stat distribution worked. And one thing that would have made more sense to me was if the stats of the weapon was determined by the blade rather than the handle. And what I mean by that is with the Greatsword of Fate, its blade doesn't really matter, or like its head doesn't really matter because all of the stats that are important are on the handle, but the handle is what controls the moveset. So I thought it would have been cooler to have like multiple great swords that had different stats, so you could have like a dexterity scaling greatsword or something like that. Just the dex weapon up top versus a motivity one versus an advanced one, like with an elemental function. But you could just swap out the handles to work with the moveset that you liked the best. But it kind of didn't work that way. It was the opposite. So there was only one booster glaive handle, and that was purely a kind of mostly dex / quality weapon, or technique / quality weapon. And that kind of pigeonholed me, I feel, more towards the technique stat distribution, even though it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do or like started out as. And that's kind of something I figured out later on. So that's just kind of my little complaint about it. Overall, I think it was a good system, but if that little bit was refined, that would have been better for me. I don't know how about like how you guys feel about that in the chat or anything though. Scalezi said, to get the best ending, you need high humanity, to kill Sophia and absorb her ergo, causing your hair to turn silver, and then to beat Nameless Puppet for a different ending cutscene. Okay, there's still hiccups? All right. Did I just hiccup right then or right now? Because I can still adjust it a little bit more. No, and this does not annoy me whatsoever. I would rather you guys have a clearer stream. So, okay, I lowered my gain a little bit more. Okay, it doesn't seem like I'm peaking quite as much. Let me know how the volume is for you guys, though. Because it's kind of like my other concern. Dr. N says, you do like that it's the handle that matters, but you think there were not enough differences. They did patch different swing speeds for the blade weight, but you wish they did more. So my question is, why should that matter like for the handle as opposed to the blade? Like, why would you prefer the handle being different? Because in my mind, the handle still matters because that is your moveset. And that, I think, gives it enough metaphorical weight to drive people into choosing what they want. Okay, volume is fine. And I know there's a little bit of a chat delay, so I might just, play the video to you guys reply and whatnot.
Equipment slots we can increase, which will help out with various resistances to certain types of damage, such as blunt, piercing, or slashing damage, or particular elemental damages that would inflict a status effect, that kind of thing. And you can find a bunch of gear, such as your armor lining or your frame, that will affect your resistances to those things. Though that is where your weight limit comes into play. You want to have about 60% of your total weight equipped before you start taking penalties to your movement, which is where the capacity stat comes in. But we're not done yet, because another option available to us is our Legion arm. As you can probably see, our left arm is a mechanical arm, and this can be modified and changed out to an arm that has a special ability.
So Dr. N said, to him, it makes sense that it's the handle because it's how you would directly engage with the weapon, and you like what they did with the damage type synergies. No, I understand that, but how, would the blade detract from that aspect? So if I use the saw, the whirligig saw essentially at the end of it, and I knew that was electric based, wouldn't it make sense to have that blade itself scale with more advanced type damage or something like that? Because that makes more sense to me, and then I don't necessarily have to worry about what handles are available to me, or like what stats I need to fit the handle, rather than working with the thing that actually does the damage, like the end part, I guess, itself. Okay, Mortis, thanks for telling me the hiccups are still going on. I don't understand why exactly. Was this happening for you guys when I was playing Lies of P? Or is it something like today? Maybe it's like internet. But I kind of doubt it, because I feel like you guys have that on the video playing too, wouldn't you? Scowley said, "You think evenly splitting the importance between blade and handle makes the system more interesting by forcing you to give it more thought?" Okay. It was fine last night? Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll adjust it a bit more, but I don't have too much room left. Hmm. All right. I just changed my noise suppression thing, so hopefully that is better. Dr. N said, "You think that's an issue more to do with how they treated advanced as a stat than the weapon assembly system itself?" Maybe. I'd be interested in like discussing that a bit further. Okay, it's not new? Okay.
Find quite a few of these over the course of the game. They can do things like perform ranged attacks for us. One is like a flamethrower. There's one that just acts as a shield that blows up when enemies hit it, which was my favorite. And one of your stats also increases your ability to use Legion arms more effectively. Now, I would say one of the other biggest forms of progression is your organ or your heart. A little ways into the game, we will get the ability to start customizing the mechanical heart that our character has, which allows us to gain extra buffs on top of everything else. This is divided up into phases. Each phase is divided up into several sections of that phase that we can slot a special material called quartz into. For every quartz we get, we can pick one of 4 different types of buffs to slot into that particular nodule of upgrades. However, you can only use one of each upgrade type per slot. And once you've filled a particular node up, you will get a passive extra benefit on top of the buffs from the individual material slots themselves. This can provide some pretty substantial buffs to your character, especially once you start getting to New Game Plus, because while there is a maximum amount that weapons and things can be upgraded, you can continue to find extra quartz to fill out this organ and thus make you stronger and stronger that way on top of just continuing to level up. And this helps you push past a sort of barrier in progression once you get to a certain point. Some of these are incredibly useful, such as one allows you to quickly use your Wish Stone in combat, which can make dealing with certain bosses and keeping your Spectre alive to help you much, much easier. And another one, probably my favorite, allows you to dodge roll after you've been knocked to the ground. So when you're lying prone on the ground, you can immediately roll that into a dodge roll, which isn't something you can do by default. And that one...
Did I miss that one? Because that was like a consistent issue I had the entire game. Oh no.
One in particular was very, very helpful. So a lot of options with upgrading that. All of the things I just mentioned can be respec'd once you reach a certain point in the title, but it is like 60% of the way through the game. So if you make a mistake or anything, it is technically possible to undo it or just simply try something else. However...
And we know they changed that, and this was like the pre-release review code copy of the game. Hey, iMan, welcome back to stream. How's it going?
You will have to play a while before you get to that point. From there, let's talk about the gameplay
and Teen Sith as well. Didn't mean to forget you.
And the world a little bit. Much like any other Souls-like, really. There are checkpoints of sorts in the game called Stargazers. At Stargazers, we can reset all the enemies in an area outside of shortcuts we've unlocked or big enemies we've taken down that don't respawn. And it's also where we can perform tasks like leveling up, switching out our Legion arm, etc. However, outside of the Stargazers, there is also a hub of sorts where we can talk to a lot of the other NPC characters. This is called Hotel Krot, and it's likely where you'll be doing a lot of your upgrades upgrading and talking to characters as well as getting their stories and everything. Outside of combat, this is a pretty big part of, I would say, the rest of the gameplay, as many of these characters can do things that will lead you to extra secrets involved in exploration or finding collectibles, etc. To give an example of this...
Okay, yeah, I remember you saying that, Scowleezy. The dodge upgrade was such an instant pick that the devs gave it to us by default and switched it out on the P organ with a different one. Okay, now that makes me feel better that I just did not miss the most quintessential pick. So it still seemed kind of slow to me. It felt like there were many times where I was not getting up as quickly as I wanted to. So I guess that was more of a me issue then. Community complaints? Okay, thank you.
There are cryptic vessels, as they're called, that can be found. These can be deciphered by someone at the hotel, and then this will lead you on a sort of treasure hunt to find a particular reward. However, many of these characters also have their own little side story that you can sort of uncover if you make certain decisions in certain places, which can tell you a little more about them, which leans into it. Now, beyond that more direct stuff, I would say the world of Lies of P is incredibly interesting. It's got that sort of Victorian era appeal to it. However, later on, there are things like swamps and cathedrals, etc. So I would say the atmosphere of this game is incredibly well done, because ultimately the game is based on an old fable, and this dark and gritty imagining of it really leans into that heavily. Many of the environments are simultaneously whimsical and ethereal while really managing to be oppressive and daunting at the same time, which makes for an appropriately sinister feel to basically everywhere you go, and that is what I think the game probably does best. So I enjoyed it quite a bit. But as I mentioned earlier, many of these areas are linear. That is to say, there are levels of sorts to the game that you'll be moving through, and while there is some mild exploration involved that might lead you down a side pathway or two, for the most part it's a pretty straight shot to the area boss, at which point killing that boss will open up the path to the next area. Personally...
Yeah, and as I was going through the game more and more, I thought the first time I was going through an area, it felt like there was a path that I needed to go back to because I hadn't explored it. And then after I went through the rest of the area and went back to, backtrack and check what was down that one path that I missed, it felt like it was always very short, and it just had a mostly inconsequential item. So, well, I was really excited going through the levels towards the beginning of the game. They just kept remaining very linear and short. And while they did have the very common Dark Souls shortcut pathing within the game, I would agree that the game felt very linear overall, which could be a good or a bad thing depending on how much you, the player, wants your handheld for exploring and going through the game. But as for me personally, I would have preferred a little bit less in general. And Iman said, "You're supposed to be a metallic puppet, clumsy as hell, so that way I shouldn't get up that quickly." But I think Iman is forgetting that I'm a real boy. I was able to pick up a cat. I should be able to pick myself up faster too. Teen Sith would probably give Lies of P at least a second new game cycle and maybe one new game plus before deciding how I feel about it. It's hard to parse it on its own terms because we're familiar with Bloodborne, etc. I don't know. I mean, I also played Lords of the Fallen before this, and after 100%ing that game, I think that really did help me decouple the idea of what a Souls-like should be from the actual Soulsborne games. So even with all that being said, I still feel kind of uncertain to a certain degree about Lies of P, so I don't necessarily entirely disagree with what you say, but yeah, maybe it would have been a bit smoother for me had I used some of those summons at times. I mean, it definitely would have been faster, but I mean, most bosses didn't really give me too many problems. It was just a couple, and I don't know if that was me misreading things or just that the telegraphing, I think, could have been better. I'm not sure about that, at least. And then Scowleezy was saying that you get a lot of really powerful upgrades to the P organ system in New Game Plus. Okay, that sounds kind of interesting. The ergo requirement for leveling up tapers off hard in New Game Plus, staying around 16,000 until about level 200. Oh, okay. So yeah, that was another one of the weirder things. It felt like I should have been gaining more ergo towards the end of the game, which, I mean, it really wasn't that big of a deal, but I was kind of surprised at times at the ergo amount. Like, I didn't think it was too, like, ridiculously low or anything. I just expected it to be slightly higher than it was. I need to love it as much as you do. Are you going to be upset? All right, hold on. Let me ban you from the channel real quick. No. Dr. N says, linearity makes no difference to you. You prefer more open-ended approaches. But for example, you don't like Lords of the Fallen did its world. It felt like playing pretend. I can see where you're coming from that. And yeah. But I feel like in many ways that same criticism could be levied at like Dark Souls 2, which is often praised for its non-linearity, and even Dark Souls 1 to a large extent. Teen Sith says, you actually hate when fights expect you to just reflex and sight read. I don't think you... I'm not entirely sure where you're coming from with this, but I think it should be like a marriage of the two, that if an attack is telegraphed well enough, and a person is being observant enough, I think it should be well within the like realms of possibility that they'll be able to like execute things very well. And I also think it should be a good thing for people to be able to like predict certain enemy attack patterns and reply appropriately at times. And I think in general, Lies of P actually did do a very good job with that, especially with the normal enemies and whatnot. It was just really a couple bosses here and there that gave me trouble in particular. Okay.
I think they struck a pretty good balance here. Like, there was a good amount of exploration, and you can teleport to all the stargazers you found, so it's easy to backtrack and find things you've missed. And it's a pretty decently sized game overall, so I never felt like I was missing out on anything, basically. That said, let's finally talk about combat a bit. Combat is, of course, the primary thing this Souls-like is trying to do. So there are, naturally, quite a few things I want to talk about here. For starters, the block and the parry system. The game calls this guard. Most enemies you either want to block or perfectly block their attacks. Otherwise, they're going to deal insane amounts of damage to you. Now, on a regular block, you will still take damage, however, you'll pick up what is called guard regain, that is to say that lighter red portion of your health bar after you get hit. If you are to hit an enemy after this happens, you can regain that lost health up to the point at which that light red is still there. Now, if you get hit again, this goes away. This is meant to incentivize you staying on the offensive and trying to pick up that health. However, that can even be mitigated by the perfect guard, or basically a parry. If you time this perfectly when an enemy hits you, instead of taking the guard regain damage, you'll take no damage and usually be in a better position to counterattack on top of that. Now, where this gets tricky is, of course, enemy timing, where they're hitting you multiple times very, very quickly, or the timing will change mid-combo, things like that. So it's a little harder to do than it is to say, but if you're good at that particular mechanic, most of the combat of this game shouldn't be that big of a deal at all. That said, you can still roll and dodge in this game, like that's definitely an option for you. However, in most situations, what you want to be doing is either blocking or trying to perfectly block something.
So this kind of reminded me that even though I did have some issues with parrying and blocking, and I think a large part of that is obviously going to be my fault, and I accept that, one part of combat which is going to be like a more personal feel is that I would have enjoyed a little bit longer punishment windows on certain bosses between their combination attacks, because it felt like there were many times they did something which should have been punishable with like a fully charged attack, but was quite often not, and that was a little bit disorienting at times, which, I mean, I think that much could be blamed on my expectations coming from other games, but it was just kind of a little bit frustrating at times when the biggest example to me would be like when a boss transitions into using their fury attack so they glow red, and then they do their attack, and if you block it or dodge it or whatnot, and then try to do a fully charged R2, and then they like are unable to connect with it because they continue to attack within that interval, that was a little bit annoying to me. So I don't know whether or not it would be better for the game to have like increased those windows or anything like that. But for me personally, I felt a little bit frustrated at times when I felt as though I should have been able to punish the boss more than I actually was. Luxasia is designed, you think, to specifically counter common greed tactics? Yeah, so she was one of the ones that did that. I noticed, like, the little lightning spark, that one wasn't too bad because, I mean, that one was telegraphed super well. It was just like when she would do a combo and then do the red attack, and then there was like one in particular where I would try to do my charged R2 from a distance, and then she would just transition back into a normal attack. That was a little bit annoying to me, but yeah. Granted, not all attacks needed to be punishable with a charged R2. I just felt like the Fury ones were a little bit infuriating. Yeah, and Iman said they did increase these windows. That was the first patch. And so this is where I'm coming from on the most recent patch, even after all of these changes.
Are situations where dodge is helpful, but usually it's not what you want to be trying to do. Now, what makes all of this tricky, of course, is the way animations and timers behind the scenes work. For instance, something I really struggled with for most of my first playthrough was the exact timing from the end of an attack I've performed to when I can start guarding. It really took me a while to really get the handle on when exactly I could guard and block, and thus when to stop attacking and start going on the defensive in between combos. Which of course means you can't simply wail on enemies and expect to win in most cases on anything besides a basic small enemy. It doesn't end there, however. Pretty much everything we just mentioned costs stamina, of course. If you run out of it, it'll be easy to break your block or your guard and open you up to attacks, so naturally we don't want that. Though our character can perform light and heavy attacks, and hitting an enemy in general is going to fill up an invisible stagger meter. When an enemy is staggered, their health bar will start to glow white, at which point if we hit them with a charged heavy attack, it will knock them down and open them up to a fatal attack, which is a big heavy damage combo attack that will deal massive damage. It's also possible to do this to some enemies if you manage to sneak up on them from behind, which makes it great for basically everything. In many cases, you want to try to be staggering enemies or bosses as quickly as you can, so you can get that big heavy attack fatal combo blow in. However,
yeah, looking back on this and comparing to Lords of the Fallen, I do really like the whole idea of having the posture stance system within the game, but I think this makes me appreciate how a little bit more naturally it was integrated in Lords of the Fallen, with being able to kick open enemies and visceral attack them while they were within that like staggerable threshold. Because I think there were 3 ways to do it in Lords of the Fallen. It would be by parrying an enemy's attack while they're already like in that weakened posture state, kicking them, which is a very like close range yet quicker melee attack, or a fully charged attack, which takes a little bit longer to set up and whatnot. So I did like in Lords of the Fallen that you had multiple avenues of approach at that. And with that being said, I appreciated that in Lies of P you were also able to stagger enemies by using the shot put. Perhaps there is something else that could like facilitate like the staggers directly, but if so, I didn't experiment with it, and that might be like my loss. But now, like kind of looking back, I do wish they had like a kick or like another like perfect guard parry to initiate the fail state, kind of like in Sekiro as well. Dr. N said, you like that this game makes you commit though? You think Souls games have become way too loose with that since Bloodborne? Yeah, I can agree with that to an extent. But I also had the same difficulty, it seems, as Mortismal Gaming here did, in that it was a little bit difficult for me to read when I was able to block versus attack at times. And I'm not entirely sure what like the fix of that would have been. And for a while, like I legitimately thought my controller was stuck because I didn't understand that there were like actually some animation differences between if you like perfectly parried something versus just guarding, and how the character's model would continue to hold up like the block animation. So that was really throwing me off, especially in the Hercules fight, because I didn't know because I was trying to gauge whether or not I was like timing things wrong, or whether or not I could not continue to block or parry. But because my shield wasn't, or like my guard posture wasn't like resetting, I couldn't tell if it was a timing issue as opposed to like a systems issue. Yeah, Hercules is Victor, the champion guy. Dr. Ann agrees with that. After a perfect parry, we should get the chance to input an action, be it a dodge or attack like Sekiro. Yeah, okay. Scaleezy said, Souls games kind of evolved into light equip roll spam. Elden Ring is a step in the right direction with the changes to shields, but late game bosses shred your stamina so much, rolling is the more viable option. Yeah, and that's kind of true a little bit for Lies of P as well. Obviously, I could have certainly increased my stamina amount a bit more, but it's kind of hard to justify doing that because the gains for stamina is really low, and so is the gains for like increasing the weapon damage. So I don't know, just because like the weapon gains were so low, it felt more incumbent upon me to keep investing into my weapon stats, so that way like my damage didn't fall off and things like remain tanky. But it's a little bit weird because I didn't really have too many issues with the small enemies. It's really just like a couple bosses here and there. Dr. N says, Elden Ring corrected some issues Dark Souls 3 had, but it increased spam in other regards. Rolling isn't as mindless, yes, and bosses ask more of you than to just roll in and avoid full combos. Elden Ring is very complicated on a number of fronts because I feel like while the combat in Elden Ring in like Dark Souls 3 has gotten looser, as I say, I would also say their boss design got a lot looser with certain enemies like Margit / Morgott and Malekith. Those are like two of the biggest ones that like stand out to me as like being able to move extremely quickly or have like very varied attack timing patterns, which is very hard to read and or react to at times. So yeah, okay.
However, enemies make this a little more complicated by the fury attacks. Sometimes, as you've probably seen on screen up to this point, when an enemy glows red, that is called a fury attack. It's a heavy damage ability that you cannot block normally. You have to perfectly parry it, or you'll take a ton of damage and usually be knocked down as well. However, both attacking and defending against everything enemies do is going to affect the durability of your weapon. This can be dealt with by the grinder that we have, which can repair our durability. However, going to a Stargazer or anything automatically resets and repairs our durability for the moment. And what's more, certain status effects, in particular decay, if we get that built up on our character, will actively eat away at your weapon durability. This is mostly a thing in the early game, I found.
So yeah, not to talk about durability right now, but this kind of reminded me, and one thing that I did really, really appreciate about Lies of P, and I think it would be like a fantastic feature to add into all of the other Souls-likes, is when you
status effects, in particular decay, if we get that built up on our character, will
get an enemy into like the downed posture position and you're able to perform your fatal attack or whatnot, that the little claw marks glow a brighter orange peachy type color to indicate that you are in the proper distance or range to execute that attack, as opposed to you just trying to figure it the hell out, because that it can be really rough at times. And Elden Ring does have something a little bit similar with like the glowing crit spot, but it isn't always clear when you can actually crit, like for like what distance or what angle you need to be at. And so yeah, kudos to the team for having this functionality included into the game. And since Mortismal is talking about durability, I still don't like it. I don't really think it adds a lot to the game. There's certainly a couple points of tension, especially in some boss fights. Maybe it encourages people to switch more between weapons, and that could be a good thing. But it just kind of was more of a nuisance to me than it really felt as like being worthwhile. Oh yeah, the putrefied tree spirit, as far as like the timing of attacks, is the worst in Elden Ring. Dr. N wishes that's why was hoping that's why Elden Ring would have more iterations on Sekiro combat with more variety like Souls. Yeah, I think that's like Elden Ring's biggest weakness. It might have been like development might have begun too early for them to really have learned a lot of the lessons from Sekiro. Because if Elden Ring even had like the Goomba Stomp, I feel like that would have added a lot more depth and complexity to combat. Or, yeah, like a couple weapons that would have like the Sekiro style block or parry. That would have been really cool too. Scalleasy said, if Elden Ring had a great rune that only showed enemy posture, it'd be the best rune in the game. You're not wrong there, which is why I want them to integrate the Lords of the Fallen posture meter into the games where it's literally on the block on indicator. It's so, like, that solution is so elegant. It's like, you can't believe it's never been done before. So you don't have to like look up awkwardly at like what's going on above the enemy with like their health bar. It's just always there. Hey Henry, welcome into stream. Been a while. Hope you're all well. You've almost platinum Bloodborne and you're enjoying it with your Geralt of the Lands Between build and Elden Ring. Nice. Glad you are enjoying Bloodborne and Elden Ring. Teen Sith said, it's funny, you're pretty sure you could find someone leveling all of Protag's complaints at any FromSoft game that's come out in the last few years. I mean, you could also look at my reviews of the FromSoft games, and I've been pretty consistent about all of these, to be fair. Although I don't have the issue of the blocking of Lies of P in a game like Sekiro, and I feel like that's what I'm like mentally comparing it to, and it feels a little bit deficient in my mind. Like, this isn't bad, but it could be better, you know? Dr. N said the lock-on indicator in Elden Ring would be amazing because you can shatter the critical more and more, like it's even fitting because of the shattering. Yeah, that's an even like brilliant way to put an Elden Ring spin or take on it.
Actively eat away at your weapon durability. This is mostly a thing in the early game, I found. Once I got about halfway through the title, this kind of stopped being as much of an issue, because there are lots of buffs and things you can get to weapon durability that make this much less of a problem. Because if your weapon durability drops to 0, your weapon breaks, which dramatically reduces your attack, and it is unfixable at that point until you find your way to a Stargazer. However, this is also something you can do to enemies. In fact, if you're really great at perfectly blocking things, much of what that does is deal damage to an enemy's weapon, so it is possible to break the weapons of even bosses to make them much easier to deal with, which again is one of the reasons being able to perfectly block well is going to save you a lot of headache here. But if that wasn't enough, we are still not done yet, because then we have the Fable arts. Each weapon...
So Iman said, some people think that Sekiro's blocking is the worst that there can be, and I understand those complaints to a degree. However, I think the issue with Sekiro isn't necessarily the blocking mechanics as much as it is the systemic gameplay, which forces parrying onto players who might not be mechanically capable of performing such actions. Whereas in Lies of P, you don't need to rely on quite the same twitchiness of blocks as Sekiro, but what I mean by I wanted it to more like Sekiro in terms of blocking is literally the animation speeds of pulling your guard, dropping your guard, pulling up your guard, and dropping your guard. So if there were like tighter windows but faster executions of being able to block, I would prefer that over this one, because it felt a little bit too slow and sluggish for my tastes, and other people might feel completely differently about that. Scallies says it can continue to just spam parry instead of learning, and yeah, that's a fair criticism to bring up as well. One thing a lot of Sekiro players had to learn was that they couldn't just spam parry. Lies of P, you have to commit and hold block. You think holding the parry button increases the parry frames a bit in Lies of P? Maybe. Like, I mean, there's definitely a lot of attacks that I parried, but some of them I just felt like were like timing issues on my part and like boss readability. And I'm a little bit curious as to whether or not if they extended the windows for certain things. I'm curious like how the original timings were different, but oh well, that's what you get for playing a game Only a couple months after release now, right? Teensit said, you remember on release one player was saying it was easier when you hold the button rather than tapping? So you guys are saying that to me in the game as well. And I noticed on like one of the last fights, it might have been like Nameless Puppet, where I had managed to actually parry, but I was actually holding the button. And I think it like parried when I let go. And I mean, at that point in the game, I couldn't necessarily replicate it because it was the final battle. So I think I might have misunderstood how the blocking mechanics worked. So I was still treating it like Sekiro, but I mean, rather than just like flicking it and letting it immediately, I would hold it until the like sound effect would make like the blocking sound, and then I would let go essentially, and then, you know, work with that. So I don't know. Yeah, parrying did not click for me in this game as well as I think it could have. But I mean, no, that's kind of a lie. Like, there's a lot of attacks that I parried all the time. Like, a lot of it was just me getting the timing down.
And that is to say,
Oh yeah, guarding cost stamina. You're going to go through the blocking attempts and see if my 14 vigor played a part in that. It probably really did. And I didn't know like perfect blocking cost stamina until like very later in the game when you like said that. I think it was when I was fighting Luxasia, and that could have affected me quite a bit, especially on the Hercules fight and the Raiden fight, because I would totally believe that. And in my mind, like perfect blocking should be free, and I could have very well been overlooking that. Like in my mind, if I have enough stamina to attack, I have enough stamina to block, but that might not have been the case. I don't know.
The blade of the weapon you have equipped will typically give you a Fable Art option, which is to say the special attack for that weapon. As we fight enemies, or simply heal ourselves in many cases, we'll be building up this particular meter, and once it reaches the point at which we need it to in order to use our special attack, we can activate it when we're ready, and this can deal all sorts of cool stuff. It's really where a lot of the variety comes in, especially in terms of the weapon assembly, outside of just making the damage numbers go up, and it makes a lot of weapons feel more unique. And then, of course, we have the damage types themselves. Each individual weapon we're using will cause a type of damage, both physically and then potentially elementally. Physical damage types like slashing, piercing, or striking, which is blunt, are pretty much what you would expect. However, we also have elemental damage types. Some weapons will deal normal physical damage plus an elemental damage type. My favorite was fire, as a lot of enemies didn't seem to resist this very well, though there were a few. And using weapons that deal both of them will then apply that status effect if you hit them enough. So all the status effects that enemies can put on you, you can also put on them. And all of that combines to make a very robust combat system that can really be played a lot of ways. And if you play it enough, you're likely to find something that you in particular enjoy. And you do have a lot of options for dealing with many of the potentially very challenging encounters, such as, again, the specters to use in boss fights to help distract the boss so you don't have to worry so much about perfectly blocking every time, to give an example there. But I do want to stress here at the end of the combat section, there is potential for frustration here, as this game can be very difficult, especially towards the end. And a lot of it is going to come down to how well you manage to learn to perfectly block enemies' attacks at the appropriate time. However, outside of the general intended challenge, I do think the game runs into a few problems in terms of its combat that are definitely worth mentioning. For starters, some enemies, and it's especially noticeable for bosses, tend to just spam the same attack combo over and over again sometimes. And I've seen bosses do like the same attack 5-6 times in a row, which at least from my perspective makes it seem like they could do some work in how the boss is determining what move to do when.
So I wonder if that got updated at all, because while there are certain definitely like exploitable attacks, they seemed, you know, decently varied for the most part. Although it did feel quite RNG based when I actually downed Luxasia. That her second phase is just a bit more passive than the other ones. Although to be fair, like at that point in the fight, I was becoming more comfortable with everything that was going on, so it might have just been like a little bit, but I feel like I did not have the same amount of mastery over this fight in particular compared to many of the other ones.
Another much bigger issue that I think is genuinely a problem is that sometimes enemies will sort of push your character into a corner and then kind of rush up on you, and at that point you cannot move out of that corner and the camera freaks out because you're in a corner. and you're basically just dead at this point because you can't see the enemy to block their attacks, and you can't move past the enemy to get out of said corner. And the problem with this is that sometimes you can be playing exactly the way you're supposed to, that is to say blocking and everything, but even a parry or a perfect block can sometimes push you back, which can sort of force you into a corner inadvertently, at which point you're suddenly dealing with this issue. And I've died many times to exactly that, and it gets kind of annoying. And then last but not least, before we move on, mostly because I didn't know where else to put this part, is the second phases with full health bars. So the game is divided up into a lot of bosses, as you might imagine, but at the end of every level there is a major boss of sorts. The first couple are pretty manageable. However, after the third one, every major boss for a level, outside of like one or two of them that have a slightly different mechanic, have a second phase with a full health bar. And I'm talking this happens like 9 or 10 times. It gets old, especially since you have to do both of these back to back, which means...
Did I one shot or like two shot Foco? Because I like don't even really remember this boss at all.
You're essentially doing 2 boss fights at the end of every single level. And in some cases, these phases have wildly different move sets as well, which can be incredibly frustrating. For starters, because the second I walked into a major boss fight,
I clowned on him. Oh yeah, I kind of vaguely remember this now. I was like using the pillars. Okay, yeah, it's starting to come back to me. Took me a couple times, okay, but it was quick. Maybe like 2 or 3.
Towards the end of the game, you pretty much know it's going to have a second phase, which just gets a little stale after a while. And the full double health bar on top of that really started to wear on my patience towards the end of the game. Now, there are a couple of bosses that don't do this and have more unique mechanics, which I preferred generally. And while this isn't insurmountable by any means, I just kind of wish they had chose to do a few different things here and there, because when I walk into a boss knowing effectively what the surprise or twist is going to be, that's not really compelling to me. But nonetheless, while that particular thing got a little stale, the combat is good enough that I think it makes up for it, but that's going to...
Yeah, towards the end of the game, I was actually more surprised that there wasn't the surprise third health bar. Just because, yeah.
come down to personal preference.
Hey Stella, welcome back to stream.
Let's talk about the Steam Deck compatibility of this particular game. Officially, the Steam Deck has a rating of playable here, and I think that might be underselling it just a smidge, as the reason it is playable technically is because the text on screen in some of the menus is very small, which is true. However, beyond that, I was somewhat pleasantly surprised here, as the game runs very well on Steam Deck. I don't personally like playing games like this with a controller, which I'm aware is kind of the opposite of what most people enjoy. However, the game ran very well on the Steam Deck. Didn't really have any frame rate issues. The game has full controller support, of course, cloud saves, etc. But remarkably, even on that smaller screen, the game still looks really good and plays very smoothly. If anything, I was surprised at
Teetsit said, Dark Souls 3 is never living Sister Frida down, huh? No, I mean, was there a 3-bar health, or 3-bar health, wow, 3 health bar boss for Frida? Orphan is 1, but he's like multi-phased. Fig is multi-phased, 1 health bar. Same with Florence. Dark Souls 2, I would prefer not to think about that game. Yeah. What about the base game of Dark Souls 3? The Twin Princes, that's only 2 though. So yeah, maybe she was kind of like groundbreaking in that regard. I really enjoy that fight, even as much of a pain in the ass as it is. So yeah. Soulless Cinders, 3-ish phases, but 2 health bars, right. Hey Revenant, how's it going? How long was my playthrough? So 15 episodes with most episodes like running between 3 hours. A couple I did like an extra half hour, and a couple I did like 4 hours on. So like 50 hours, something like that. Yeah, there weren't ever like 3 distinct health bars. The 3rd phase reveal on Frida is a YouTube reaction compilation video topic. Indeed, yeah. The consolation slab in the Frida fight. Oh man, that is so dirty though. You're like, oh yeah, I beat this. I got an item. And then, oof, they really get you with that. Because it's like not even the 1st and 2nd phase are pushovers by any stretch of the imagination. The Twin Princes are technically 3 health bars, but it's scaled to be a small gimmick. Well, yeah, I mean, but like in phase 2, Lorian's health bar kind of disappears. So You're not exactly wrong, but yeah. So somebody else had said something. I missed it. Oh yeah, Dr. N said you never understood the criticism about like the health bars. It makes no sense. It makes no difference to you mentally. Yeah, I can get that. I think part of it is I have felt a little bit of fatigue from having so many health bars on Sword Saint Ishin, particularly because it's like after I got through phase 3 or like health bar 3, having that fourth one was definitely extra mentally taxing on me. That's pretty much like the only time where I've really felt it, but generally I feel similarly. Load bearing uses technically there. All right, so and then Scowleezy said you'd give Liza P a solid 7 or 8 out of 10, but all the little quality of life changes add up so much that you appreciate it way more over its objective value. Yeah, so I'm on the fence as to whether I'd give Liza P an 8. I'm leaning more towards 8 than 7, to be honest. I do think in some ways it's definitely better than Lords of the Fallen, but I'd kind of like want to go back and compare the two. I think it's in many ways it's definitely better than like Dark Souls 1, especially, you know, now in 2024. I don't necessarily think it's super fair to compare the two, but is it better than Dark Souls 3? In some ways, yeah, but it's kind of like apples and oranges. I think I prefer Dark Souls 3 for different reasons in terms of like the combat mechanics. But I like a lot of the systemic stuff in Lies of P with like the weapon crafting and the somewhat more easily accessible access to elemental stuff, I guess. Scowleezy said some of Lies of P felt like obligatory 2-phase boss because FromSoft does it. Yeah, and that's kind of one of my criticisms about Lords of the Fallen as well. Like, it felt like they're really sticking a little bit too much to the formula rather than doing their own thing. So in some ways, Lords of the Fallen is a bit more original feeling at times with what they do in terms of how they crafted the environment, at least. Whereas Lies of P felt a lot more cookie cutter, and the way they were more original was like on the system side of things with the upgrades. Is Demon Prince from the Ringed City the only boss to have a phase 2 variant? I'm trying to think. I felt like there was another boss somewhere. Depending on how you access it, it could change, but I don't necessarily think it was like phase 2. Scowleezy says Lies of P definitely has some first game in the series roughness to it. It's also the dev's first game ever. Yeah, and so this is a very, very commendable first game by all means. Oh yeah, Ornstein and Smo. There you go. Thank you, Teen Sith. Perfect example. What more needs to be said?
I didn't run into more issues here because just judging by the general scenery and things, I was expecting more problems, but there's really no reason you couldn't play this almost entirely on the Steam Deck if you wanted to. That, however, brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, we have the combat, of course. I think they did a lot here that makes the game feel fun and unique, especially with all the different ways you can approach it. Probably my favorite part of which was simply the weapon assembly system. I think that adds so much customization to what you're able to do as a player to find something that works for you specifically, and I really liked that system. Though in general, I think the combat is really great. And I also really enjoyed running around finding all these secrets and dealing with the NPCs that have their own little side mysteries to discover, and combined with the plot about either telling the truth or lying to these people in relation to those mysteries, I got a lot out of that personally. However, the game does have some negatives. For starters, the camera, as I mentioned, there are times where you get pushed into a wall or the camera just doesn't seem to work really well. And in a game that's already challenging when you're dying because you can't see what the enemy's doing because the camera's freaking out on you because you got pushed into a wall or something, gets old pretty quick. And
to be honest, maybe it was worse in the pre-release build of the game, but I feel like these camera complaints, while they can be valid, I mean, this is just kind of a consistent issue with this genre of game, it feels, where things can get a little bit cluttered very quickly if you're in close quarters. And yeah, it's just been very persistent. Like Bloodborne has it, Elden Ring has it, Dark Souls 3 has it, Lords of the Fallen has it, Lies of P has it to a smaller degree. But honestly, I think the camera in this was a lot better than some of the other ones. The lock-on was pretty good. There's only once or twice, I think, where I was like, oh, I didn't mean to lock on to that enemy, rather than yeah, anyway, so I really don't feel like the camera was that big of an issue. Maybe things were different. And I'm kind of curious if part of it was because our boy was on keyboard and mouse there.
It's probably my biggest problem with this game by far. However, other things like enemies just spamming the same move at you, especially when it's a boss, is just underwhelming to say the least, which goes along with a lot of the major bosses having a full second phase with a full health bar that they just do over and over and over again. I do wish there was more variety in what they tried to do with some of those bosses, because like every major boss coming down to big clunky first phase followed by much lighter and faster second phase with big combos just got very predictable towards the end.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a fair criticism. It was always big first and then small fast second, which I didn't put together on my own. Like, I mean, that's definitely the case. I just didn't think to put it all in perspective, I guess.
Everything beyond that, though, is minor nitpicky stuff. For instance, I think the hub area could have been laid out a little better to keep you from running to individual points to deal with a certain vendor or upgrade a certain thing. For instance, upgrading your heart is upstairs in the hotel, but like all the vendors and stuff are downstairs. So every time I want to do this, I have to run almost entirely around the hotel stairs when everything else in the hotel is like way away from that. So just like little nitpicky stuff I think could be cleaned up a little bit. But all of that...
That's kind of funny because like that's one of those things where I definitely hear what he's saying, and there is like a big grain of truth to it, that it does get a little bit tedious if you're just trying to upgrade your P organ at the thing upstairs. And maybe like the more elegant solution would be to have like left it upstairs, but then put the shop menu on the Stargazer like they did with the assembling weapons and switching the Legion arms. I was a little bit disappointed that I couldn't always upgrade my weapons from the Stargazers, but I guess looking back, I should instead appreciate that I was even able to like switch out my arms and whatnot at the Stargazers. I don't know. Probably like a little bit of a column A and column B. And one like positive thing of having to like go all the way upstairs to the quartz place was that you would be more incentivized to talk to Geppetto or look at the painting. Maybe it makes the hotel feel like a more realistic area. I don't know. I feel like it's one of those things where the devs are a little bit damned if they do and damned if they don't.
That brings me to my conclusion. I had a blast playing Lies of P. It was a very enjoyable experience for me. I played through it several times to see the endings. The story was better than I expected, the combat was great, and while it does have some issues here and there, I don't think they outweigh how well the game does everything else it's trying to do, which made it a pretty enjoyable experience. This particular game is $60 US on Steam, and whatever that is, of course, regionally for people, but this game is also on Game Pass for very cheap as well, which makes it pretty easy to recommend if you like Souls-likes. I will tell you that if you don't like this kind of game, this one isn't going to change your mind. It can be a very challenging and frustrating game at points, and some people are just never going to enjoy that. But if you like this kind of game, it's very enjoyable, which makes it easy for me to recommend as a buy, especially if you're on Game Pass, because that's obviously just a great way to enjoy this without spending $60 on it. For me, I would say even...
So I think in many ways, Lies of P is probably a really good entry point into the Soulsborne genre. Yeah, that's going to be interesting moving forward, that there's going to be a group of gamers whose first Souls-like is going to have been Lies of P. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around that, because that's just kind of wild to me. So I'm very curious as to what that demographic would think about playing games like Elden Ring or Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, etc. Yeah, that is going to be very interesting to me. Okay. No, I didn't get got by the piston staircase. I was too busy looking at chat, and so I heard the things go off, and so I was alerted to them. Dr. N was also surprised that at least half the Legion arms were good and fun to use. Not even Sekiro managed that, even if the puppet string is that much better. So I didn't mess around with the Legion arms that much because the electric arm that I had, it felt like way too slow, not very effective for a lot of the combat in the game. And then kind of the same instance with the flamethrower, it just felt like its range is a little too slow for me. So I just mostly stuck to the Aegis and the puppet string, and I did not use the puppet string nearly as much as I probably should have. And it probably took me a really long time to use the Aegis just because of muscle memory of playing through FromSoft's games and not ever really needing to use those. Stella said, people who played the later games first went back to play DS1 or Demon Souls and were surprised how slow they were in comparison. Yeah, and so the thing is, like, even though Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 and 2 especially are very slow, I'm curious about, like, somebody who's played this first, how they would feel about those games, because they're going to be slower, which is fine, but just maybe I'm curious about like what they would think about Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne especially. Yeah, especially Bloodborne compared to Lies of P, because they're very like in many ways like Lies of P and its movement felt more similar to Bloodborne than a lot of like FromSoft games somehow, but the parrying system was just like completely different and not like Bloodborne at all. So I would be really curious to see how they would feel about Bloodborne, especially if they played this one first. Sidestep and Rally, yeah. And so thanks for mentioning Rally again, because that was something I wanted to like circle back towards, but I kind of forgot. And so I probably would have been better off blocking a lot more in Lies of P and trying to rally a bit more, or just doing like the dodge mechanic. But having the Fury-based attacks not be iframeable with the dodge natively kind of spurred me into trying to get better at parrying, because at one point, I would need to have to do that. So I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing in the grand scheme of things, because I didn't like the parry system as much as I could have, I feel. And obviously when I stopped relying on the parry system, I actually started like beating the crap out of the bosses. So when I stopped focusing on like parrying against Ramco, I just started like dodging into and through his attacks, Bloodborne style, and then I like killed him after the second or third attempt of trying to switch up my playstyle. I struggled with Hercules. That was just like a me get good moment. I totally accept that. And then when I got to the end, I started dodging more of Laxasia's attacks. That was like a little bit of RNG, so I won't count that one. But I did not have any problems with Simon Manus. I was just dodging a lot more rather than trying to parry. Although, to be fair, like his attacks were telegraphed very well and very easy to read and were mostly easy to parry, so I didn't have too many issues with him. And then even the Nameless Puppets, that one was a pretty tough boss. But once I started to incorporate more dodging and weaving, it became a lot more manageable. So I feel like Lies of P inadvertently funnels more people down the path of parrying to the point where it kind of hinders what could be like a better method of boss progression. And like this is only like a boss specific issue for some of them, and even that quote unquote issue might be completely mitigated by the summon system, which I didn't interact with at all. So anyway, that's just kind of like my thoughts on that for now. All right, Boxer Wing, you have a good night. Thanks for letting me know about the audio issues. Hopefully I fixed those, and if I haven't, please let me know. Not you specifically, but just anybody in chat. Dr. N like Lies of P's Rally more than Bloodborne's. Dr. N, have you played the new Lords of the Fallen? And if so, what do you think of that wither mechanic? Because I'm curious, because I feel like I prefer the wither mechanic in that game, even though fundamentally it's very similar to this. I don't know exactly why, and I think I would need to like look back as to which I prefer, or why I prefer it. It's a touch choppy. Okay, I think I can fix it ever so slightly more.
$60 is well worth it, especially if you're going to play through it multiple times. All of that said, that's going to do it for me. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. By all means, let me know what you think of this title down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
Alright, so that was a really good video by Mortismal Gaming. Covered a lot of the points that I was focused on as well. Didn't go in as much depth as I would have expected for like the respecking system, but maybe he didn't mess around with that too much. Anyway, I really appreciated that one. So rather than going into Pinocchio's story about art and God right now, I kind of want to look at Ratatoskr's, since I'm kind of like fired up on the whole review aspect of things. So we'll just do a little bit of a switcheroo and do Lies of P is the best Souls-like if you like to lose by Ratatoskr.
I don't like Souls.
Dr. N's general opinion on Lords of the Fallen is cool. You want to see what they make of it 2 games down the line? Yeah, I could see that. It's kind of hard to tell.
I think they're all bad, even the ones that are really good. And that goes for pretty much all of them. Neo.
All right, I'm going to restart it.
I don't like Souls-likes. I think they're all bad, even the ones that are really good. And that goes for pretty much all of them. Neo, Mortal Shell, Code Vein, The Surge, the original Lords of the Fallen. Some of these might excel in a few things, but they also fall short in other ways.
Yeah, I guess I really haven't played a lot of Souls-likes. I haven't played the Neo games. I haven't played Code Vein or Mortal Shell. I wanted to play Neo and Mortal Shell, but I was kind of like focusing on other stuff and was waiting to see if it was like, oh man, you must play this type of game, because I don't know, I feel like that's like at this point in my life, if I'm going to devote the time of like actually going through and really playing a game, it needs to be really good, because I mean I've played a bunch of games in my life, and so a lot of them don't impress me nearly as much as they used to. So Teensit says Lords of the Fallen has what she sees as a major system/mechanic bloat problem, to be honest. Yeah, I agree with that 100%, that a lot of its systems are really holding it back, but I think that's actually really easily fixable, which is kind of really frustrating to me, because I think underneath all that extra garbage, it's a pretty solid game, everything else considered. Scallies, you said Mortal Shell is decent enough. Shame the coolest looking character has the smallest stamina. So yeah, Mortal Shell I heard was pretty good, but like none of these just really seem to cross the threshold of like unanimous, oh yeah, that's a good game, that kind of like would have spurred me on to like really go the extra mile and try it out for myself. So with that being said, like Lies of P actually had that going for it, where it was something that I wrote off because I was not very impressed by its initial trailers, but a lot of the fan feedback was kind of overwhelmingly positive, and so I was like, okay, well, if this many people are saying it, even though it doesn't look that great to me, maybe I should do something different and just kind of like stream my experience of that, because I don't think I would have checked this game out on my own otherwise. Especially not if there wasn't all that's kind of a positivity surrounding the game. Dr. N couldn't get into Mortal Shell. The demo for Lies of P made a lot of waves. Yeah. Okay.
Neo, for example, has interesting gameplay, but it also has terrible level design, and its story is nothing to write home about. Actually, that's a pernicious problem with these Souls-likes. Most of their stories are lame. In my opinion, they're not good, and they don't even have the decency to be bad in an obvious way. Many of them choose to imitate the From Software storytelling style, where the story is obscure and needs to be discovered, and even interpreted. And that works for From Software because From Software stories are great. They're excellent. I'm happy to delve into a From Software world and interpret its story, discover its story, because the story that I'm discovering is always worthwhile. Souls-like.
So even though I haven't played a lot of Souls-like, I definitely recognize this as as a big issue for a lot of these games. I think one thing which separates FromSoft from these kind of other companies is that there's always a lot of layers in the Soulsborne games, and so they feel like worlds that might not exactly be alive right now, but they feel lived in at one point. And if you just kind of like look beneath the surface, you could kind of still find the traces of like the how and why they were lived in the way that they were. Whereas a lot of these other games just seem to be imitators, and they don't understand that if you have a ruin someplace, there should be significance to why that ruin was even there to begin with, and what that ruin represented in its like heyday, which is, kind of a little bit ironic because a lot of the FromSoft games just kind of have ruins or like shrines and whatnot, which are dilapidated and run down, and they're not really expanded upon at all. But nonetheless, like many of them still do have a certain kind of relevance to the world that's kind of hard to explain and put one's finger on. Like just seeing Andre at the tiny ash chapel next to the other chapel with the bell gargoyles makes it feel a little bit more lived in. It's kind of like a smaller, more forgotten sanctuary. And there's just a lot of depth to the games, which its imitators cannot imitate. Dr. N said, even Smotown turned to Lies of P, if you remember correctly. I was looking to see if Smo had a review of Lies of P, but I did not. But I know he was a big fan of Lords of the Fallen, which is really funny because I know he was like really on the fence and more or less against it before it released, which is really funny to watch him do that 180 on his review. Souls Cockats adding proper nouns to everything makes it seem legitimate. Skal says, even the main stories aren't that hard to decipher in the From's games. It's just that they put tons of background lore everywhere for us to discover. And as they say, like, the proof is in the pudding, and the devil is in the details, and FromSoft does a good job with that, even if they're just kind of like flying by the seat of their pants, regardless.
Likes don't do that. Normally what I find is that they have a bad story that just took longer to understand. I should probably make clear here that I'm not including something like Hollow Knight or Blasphemous as a Souls-likes for the purposes of this discussion. We're talking about 3D, sword-wielding Souls-likes. The ones that are very obviously taking direct inspiration from Dark Souls.
That's kind of funny because I wouldn't have like thought to compare Hollow Knight to Dark Souls in that regard, but I guess I can see why people would make the comparison. But in my mind, Hollow Knight is like purely Metroidvania, and while Dark Souls and like the FromSoft games are definitely Metroidvanias, and I'll fight you about that, they're just Metroidvanias in a kind of very different direction to me than this. So it's kind of an interesting disclaimer. So I'm curious why he felt the need to include this specifically, because it must come up to him at some point, I'm sure.
So don't come at me about the lore in Hollow Knight being good. I get it. I get it. My point is, Souls games scratch a very specific itch that Souls-likes just can't seem to. Except for Lies of P. I think this is the best Souls-like, and the closest thing you're going to get to a From Software game that doesn't actually come from Software. I've seen people discount Lies of P as discount Bloodborne, that it's too derivative, and there's some truth to that. It does do a lot to imitate a From Software title. But there's a lot of flattery in this imitation. And more importantly, it's imitation that worked. It's imitation that succeeded. It actually does achieve the level of quality that usually is reserved only for From Software titles.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to exactly explain why it seems to work the way that it does. I feel like compared to a game like Lords of the Fallen, how do... Like, So, this is all like a vibe check system, so I'd really have nothing to back this up. So just to like put that out there, Lords of the Fallen gives off the vibes that it's taking itself seriously as its kind of own original thing, and as though it doesn't want to acknowledge like Dark Souls and whatnot. But it feels like Lies of P is kind of approaching that from the opposite angle, where it's like, oh yeah, we actually love Bloodborne. That's why this game is so much like the stuff. Like we appreciate what they've done, and we want to like take what they've done but do it in a different direction. And so it feels like Lies of P just completely owns that it's a Souls-like, and because it does, it accepts it, and that like allows players to accept it more readily too, I feel. And of course, like I just said a moment ago, this is like all a vibes check system. So let me know if you guys feel similarly. Like, does Lords of the Fallen feel different? Like it doesn't want to acknowledge that it's a Souls-like, even though it most certainly is, whereas Lies of P is a bit more honest with itself about that? And is that why it's able to excel? Yeah, I don't know. Scalise said, Lies of P understands why the Souls games worked, while the games just copy the mechanics and think that's enough. Exactly. And I think Lords of the Fallen really lost a lot of points for me because they just made really extremely obtuse quest lines for the sake of having really obtuse quest lines. And it's like, you guys were doing a lot better as a game when you were kind of like focusing on your own stuff and not just trying to stick to some kind of arbitrary FromSoft system that was made in like 2016. Like we're in 2023 at that time. Just do 2023 things, you know? So it says the story certainly is a derivative, maybe not of a FromSoft game, but is a derivative of a Pinocchio title? I digress. Stella means derivative of a From game. It is derived from Pinocchio, obviously. Okay. Dr. N says, you don't know, but when you see your PS5 notifies you there's a new Lords of the Fallen update, you get angry. Meanwhile, the Wo Long announcement for Lies of P makes you happy. So I've heard not so great things about Wo Long, so I'm assuming it's the Lies of P part which makes you happy. And to be fair, I kind of agree with you there that when I'm seeing the updates for Lords of the Fallen, I am getting more annoyed because I feel like they're not fixing the things that I would have prioritized. And so that definitely frustrates me a little bit because I think it could be a much better game than it is, and it's really actually easily fixable. Revenant asks, have I played Blasphemous? No, I have not. Lords of the Fallen has Bucket Solaire. It's whatever. I mean, Bucket Solaire's quest is extremely obtuse, and that's coming from me, like one of the dudes who made like the video guide for it the day after it released, because I was on the Lord of the Fallen Discord trying to figure it out with everybody. Yeah, Teen Sith is saying the same thing about understanding the FromSoft games. Hey Crimson, welcome back to the stream. You're pretty sure the devs and the director openly have stated that before? That was a good vibe check? Okay. Sorry, when you said like before LP, I'm like, are you saying like Lies of P? It took me a second to parse that you're saying Last Protagonist there. Asnex says, good Souls-like games accept their origin without letting themselves be bound by them. Yeah, and I feel like the other games are definitely bound by the FromSoft shadow. I think that's a really good way to say it there. Hey Elliot, welcome back. You've thought that about Lords of the Fallen and Dark Souls 2? Like your initial takeaway from Dark Souls 2 is that they believe their own marketing about what Dark Souls was rather than what actually worked. And yeah, that's why I also compared Lords of the Fallen to Dark Souls 2 in my review. And I think if I was to talk to somebody who doesn't know about Lords of the Fallen or Lies of P, and they were asking me like what I would recommend, I would kind of stand by what I said and say that like Lords of the Fallen is like the ideal form of Dark Souls 2, whereas Lies of P is kind of like a different take or a spin on like Bloodborne's formula. And depending on what you preferred between those two games, I feel like that will guide you into the direction of which one of these two games you would prefer. And yeah, I don't know, like there's a lot of Lords of the Fallen systems combat mechanics that I do like, but I think I liked and enjoyed the combat in Lies of P a little bit more, just because maybe it had more enemy variety and it was just kind of easier to like go through. There's also like a lot less tension because you don't have to deal with Umbral. But with that being said, I also did like the status effects of Lords of the Fallen a lot more, and the magic system was a lot more robust, and the range system was a lot more robust. Okay, I know what it is. So in Lies of P, you have a hell of a lot more freedom to work with your weapons and weapon options, whereas Lords of the Fallen felt very stale because while it has a lot of weapons, there are very few weapon archetypes. So there's really only like 2 or 3 kind of builds that you really go through in Lords of the Fallen, and they're all very, very similar with like a few like magic flavor exceptions and differences there. But Lies of P, it feels like it has a lot more variety, even though it's ironically a more linear game. So yeah, I think that's kind of where my headspace is at right now. Tinsith said, "Didn't you tell me that if I liked Bloodborne's gameplay that you'd probably like Lies of P?" I mean, you're not the only person who compared Lies of P to Bloodborne, but yes, you were definitely one of them. All right, going back to the video now.
And it's not just an imitation, it also innovates. Some things it does do better. Combat in Lies of P has all of the Souls staples, the blocking, the parrying, the dodging, the deliberate attacks, the finding opportunities and taking advantage of them, to the point that it's actually easier to talk about what it does differently rather than what it does the same. So here are the systems in combat that are unique. First of all, it has a system similar to Rally in Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, when you took damage, you could regain some of that health by attacking the enemy soon after, which incentivized aggressive play. In Lies of P, it's a little different. You don't retain health that way when you take damage, you retain health that way when you block. In the game, it's called the Guard Regain, and you can get all of that health back if you attack the enemy before the Guard Regain goes away. It will disappear over time, or if you take any damage while you're not blocking. The game also has a parry system similar to Sekiro. If you time your block just before the enemy attacks, you will perform a perfect block to the monster. A perfect guard will consume stamina, but it won't consume any health. Like in Sekiro, enemies have a stagger gauge, although it's not visible in Lies of P. And those enemies will take stagger damage from all of your attacks and perfect guards. Eventually they'll enter a staggerable state with their HP bar flashing white. Once this happens, if you hit the enemy with a fully charged heavy attack, the enemy will be fully staggered and open to a fatal attack. Each weapon also has access to 2 Fable Arts. Fable Arts are the equivalent of weapon arts in Elden Ring. Each one varies quite a bit. Some of them will just do one big attack or a series of several attacks. Some will buff your weapons. They have a variety of effects. Fable Arts use up Fable slots, which you can see here under the health bar. And you fill Fable slots by continuously attacking enemies in combat. The Fable Arts that let you perform attacks also have the added effect of staggering the enemy when his health bar flashes white and is then able to receive a fatal attack. Your character also has access to Legion arms. These replace your mechanical arm with others with different effects, such as an electrical charge, a flamethrower, a cannon. These arms can be unlocked and upgraded with resources you find in the world. And the upgrades you can unlock could be substantial. They often upgrade it in a way that changes how it's used.
I was kind of surprised that we didn't find more Legion arms as we went through the game, because I don't know, it just seemed like it would have been a natural thing to do, especially as like you're learning more about alchemists and puppets in general. So yeah, that isn't necessarily a negative. It was just not expected whatsoever.
Healing items work similarly to Elden Ring, and they need to last you until you replenish them at the next checkpoint or after the next boss. But the healing does have the added mechanic that if you use all of your healing, you will be able to replenish 1 by attacking the monster. You won't be able to get more than 1, but you can keep using up that 1 and then charging for the next one. This is a really excellent feature and shockingly useful for combat with bosses, since you can use up all of your healing, but if you perform well enough from that point forward, you can potentially have a very big comeback. Weapons have a unique feature in this.
Yeah, I think that is something I may have underappreciated, especially as I used multiple of the emergency heals on like certain bosses. I don't remember if I like beat a boss because of that. Maybe I did, but either way, like it still allowed me to have a bit of extra time to work with the boss, learn its attacks and whatnot. And so if you kind of keep having a positive momentum, that's a good way to like keep that going, because you're not necessarily spamming heals and just kind of out pacing the boss, I guess. You are like kind of winning a battle of attrition. So yeah, I think that is a pretty elegant system as to being able to keep people on move and whatnot. Oh yeah, and that also became useful for me a couple times while I was traversing areas. So that's pretty good. So it's not as free as Elden stuff, but I think it might be a better system just because it does add tension if you're running low on things, but doesn't get trivialized if you're doing well. Elliot says, Lords in Dark Souls 2 felt arbitrarily cruel to him a lot of the time. Like, what's the seemingly endless series of frustrating traps it makes actually in aid of? Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and it's especially why I didn't like Dark Souls 2, but I didn't really mind it too much in Lords of the Fallen because the game didn't, like, it presented itself as kind of like a darker world, and it just felt a bit more thematic to me, even though I feel like some of the things could have been refined a little bit more. Dr. N says, speaking of Lords of the Fallen's magic systems and anti-spam mechanics, it'd be awesome if an Elden Ring using primeval current adjacent spells slowly crystallized you, increasing stamina costs and limiting movement. Yeah, so I think that was a really brilliant way for them to disincentivize people from like spamming magic, because even though it still does like have a magic cost and whatnot, it's just disincentivized spam, I guess. So that's just kind of a good thing. Elliot said, the recharging cell is smart. The result was no point did you really go, well, this attempt is completely wasted, and gave up. There was always hope you could pull it out, so you kept the effort. I definitely gave up a time or two when I felt like I was not performing up to my own standards. So, but yeah, it definitely was nice to have that extra little crutch to rely on at times.
This game in that they are comprised of a handle and a blade. The handle determines the weapon's moveset and its scaling, and has a fable art associated to it. The blade portion of the weapon is the part that you upgrade, and it has a different fable art associated to it. When you get a weapon, it'll come attached to its handle, but you can unattach that handle and attach that blade or handle to any other blade or handle, which lets you give your weapons a variety of different lengths, different movesets, different scaling, and makes it match fable arts in a unique way. It's an interesting system, and because the handles and blades don't require any materials to put them together or separate them, it encourages experimentation. And it heightens the value of new weapons that you find, because even if you don't use the blade portion of the new weapon, the handle could give your existing weapons a new moveset that you like, or scaling that you want. Finally, the last type of upgrade is your P-organs. These upgrades give you benefits like adding another fable slot, increasing the amount of healing you can use, being able to dodge twice in succession, increase the number of amulet equipable slots, or the ability to dodge quickly when you've been knocked to the ground. Those are just some examples. Now these upgrades come in tiers, so in order to unlock the ability to upgrade the second tier of abilities, you first need to get 2 abilities from the first phase. To unlock the third set of abilities, you need to upgrade 4 abilities total from the first and second phase. Unlocking these abilities is a little bit unique. Each tier of abilities has a certain number of slots that need to be filled before you have finally unlocked the ability. In the first tier, that's just 2. To fill these slots, you use the special upgrade material called the quartz, and each time you insert a quartz into a slot, you get to choose a minor buff separate than the upgrade that you're working towards. These minor buffs are things like enhance the stagger attack of charge attacks, enhance the attack of fatal attacks, enhance the attack of fable arts, increase the enemy's stagger duration, enhances guard regain recovery when attacking enemies, lowers the damage received when you heal. There's a lot of variety. When you first start upgrading your P organ, inserting a quartz will give you access to 16 different abilities to choose from, and that number just increases the more you start upgrading higher tiers. All of these systems are very polished, and they work together with the base Souls-like combat to give Lies of P its unique identity. Since we talked about the combat, we should probably focus on that. And this, I think, is the most important part of the video. If you are on the fence about getting Lies of P, this is the part you need to listen to. Lies of P is hard. It's very, very hard. Most people are going to have a tough time with this game, even if they are from software veterans and are used to that style. And that's because Lies of P has a lot of elements that makes it abnormally difficult, at least compared to what the average FromSoft player is used to. So first of all, let's talk about the source of this difficulty. What are the attributes that are making it so hard? The biggest thing is that when you're stuck in a boss fight in Lies of P, your only option, really, is to get good. There's a limit to the variety of builds you can make because all the builds are melee builds. There's no ranged or magic options, which many people consider easier in games like Elden Ring. No, this is more like Sekiro, in that the combat experience, the boss experience, is more focused. The melee...
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point to bring up, and it's something that I would tend to overlook in general because I play the games the way that I want to, which is kind of a little bit more masochistic, being typically pure melee and getting like up front in the boss's faces and duking it out, just because, I don't know, that's what appeals to me. And so like staying way back in the back lines and using ranged and stuff is just not my general style of play. So it is kind of good to kind of have these disclaimers because for some reason people play games differently than the way that I do, you know?
Combat does still provide a great deal of variety.
Yeah, and then Teen Sith brings up the time that I fought a Deathrite bird with a Frost and Bleed weapon on the 1.0 version of Elden Ring. Yeah, that's just the way that I roll.
With the weapon mixing and matching and the Fable Arts and the Legion Arm and the different way that blocking and parrying and dodging work. But still, it is melee combat, and you only have access to melee combat. If you're struggling at a boss or struggling with the game, you have no option to make a magic build. You can't radically change how the game is going to play. You can choose to get a different weapon, you can assemble a new weapon, you can change how your build is going to work, and that might help you. But at the end of the day, you are still going to be fighting these bosses at close range. You're going to be playing at their tempo. You're going to need to learn their timings. And for some people, that's going to be a problem because some of those timings can be rough. I've already described how the parrying works. It works kind of like Sekiro. But there's a big difference here. And that's that parrying in Lies of P is a lot harder to do. In Sekiro, if I'm trying to deflect boss attacks and I'm having trouble predicting where they're going to come from, or he's overwhelmed me with the amount that he's doing, then I often would just spam the parry button. I'd just guess and tap that sucker. And that was a sound strategy that would work. You might still take a few hits, but you would deflect a lot of them. In Lies of P, that is not going to fly. The timing to the parrying seems much tighter, and it's certainly not something that you want to try and spam. Here's the best advice when it comes to parrying. If you are trying to parry an attack, and you push the parry button, and you press it far too early and you see the attack still coming to you, do not attempt to let go of the block button and then try and parry again. Most of the time that's not going to work. You don't have enough time.
Yeah, and it took me a really long time to realize that not only should you not try to parry again, you should just try to dodge if you can, because like if you screw up and like do it too early, that's it. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. You either take the L or try again next time, which I mean is essentially the same thing. Hey, Global Sequence, welcome back. You know Ratatoskr's voice when you hear it? Yeah, hell yeah. Elliot says, it makes sense when he points it out, but not gonna lie, you didn't notice the lack of magic or range at all. You're a longsword liker and a saw cleaver stand, and if there's a shield, you'll be behind the biggest one every time. So there was a little bit of ranged with like the consumables, and there are a decent amount of consumables and a decent amount of slots to use them if you so chose. But of course, that also requires a sizable investment of purchasing those consumables, which isn't always feasible depending on the section of the game that you're in. Teen Sith didn't find Lies of P super hard to get into, but that's probably just because you like Bloodborne so much. Yeah, generally speaking, I did not have many problems with Lies of P. It was just the one odd boss here and there. Well, really it was like 3 bosses between Raiden, Laxasia, and Hercules Victor. I don't think Victor was difficult because of my build. I was just having a skill issue, like straight up. Like I knew what I needed to do, but I was just having an off night because like my button presses were not, like my body was not trying to listen to what my head was telling it to do. So that was just a pure skill issue on my part, because I felt like that fight was not hard, but I was making it hard. If that makes sense. He needs to have me on his podcast. If he has a podcast, I should probably like listen to it sometime. I'm pretty bad at like keeping up with creators and whatnot. I mean, you know, kind of me going through this whole streaming adventure was to kind of broaden my horizons and hear what others have to say about it. Elliot says, when their arm moves towards you is something you can never make click, but parry when it's going to hit you is simple for you. I didn't see Fake Love's facial expressions when he saw what weapon I was using. I talked to him a little bit after stream, or maybe the next day, and he's like, oh, the booster glaive has some range issues. I was like, oh, really? And he's like, yeah, you were having that issue fighting that boss. And I was like, I don't necessarily think it was the weapon as much as it was me not understanding the combat at that level of the game. Or maybe I should say that differently. I didn't understand that level of combat at that point in the game. So it took me a long time to realize that I needed to first have my character face the opponent after certain movements, so that way I could track on more easily. I didn't realize it wasn't automatic, like Streets of Rage or something like Terry. Anyway.
You're much better off just holding down the block button and blocking the attack. In this way, the mitigated damage will become guard regain, and you can get it back through attacking the enemy. The parry timing is simply too precise for you to pull it off by spamming it. Enemies also have these red attacks called Fury attacks. These are unique in that you can't block these attacks, and you can't even dodge them. You have to parry them or avoid them completely. When I say you can't dodge them, I mean you have to completely get out of the way of the attack. You can't iframe through it. And in many boss battles, depending on where you're standing when the enemy...
I think that would be a really good way of saying it. Maybe a little bit awkward for the game, but like, you can't iframe Fury attacks. That makes way more sense to me than you can't dodge them, because I was like, wait a second, if I'm on this side of the map and he does a Fury thing, I have to block it? That just kind of like made no sense to me, but saying no iframes, dumbass, that just clicks in a way. I don't know.
Initiates these Fury attacks, you may not have time to physically get out of their way. And since you can't iframe through them, you'll often be in a position where you just have to try and get that parry. You're going to need to learn the parry, because it's often the safest choice. The enemy bosses are just too dangerous to stay in the fight for long.
Yeah, so Teen Sith says, Ratatoskr is so far the most effective at clearly explaining the game mechanics. And that is something that I do admire Ratatoskr for. He's very articulate in either like the script writing and whatnot, or like the delivery. And it's very easy to follow along with what he says. And just the fact that he complains so much, I think, shows that he does have a very particular way with words, which is very easy to understand, which is why he has the audience that he has. So that's especially why I wanted to look at his video on this, especially because his feelings on Lords of the Fallen was very different from mine. So I was curious to see like what we would align with together in his review here.
Learning the boss's attack timings and parrying these timings will make the boss fight last less long, since he'll be building up stagger damage the entire time that you parry him. The dodge in Lies of P is fairly short range, and at the beginning of the game you can't link two dodges together. There's a short cooldown before you can dodge again. But that doesn't mean that the dodges don't have a purpose in boss fights. You'll want to parry as much as possible, but there will be some boss attacks that are just too tricky. You might have trouble getting the timing right, or some attacks that if you dodge them will put you in an optimal position to counter. Judicious use of your parries, your blocks, and your dodges will end up being more effective than insisting on using one or the other. But even if you understand what I'm saying and keep all of this in mind as you play, this game is still hard.
So last night when somebody asked me what my least favorite boss in the game was, I was really deciding whether or not it was this or Swampy. But to be honest, at that point in the game, I couldn't remember this well enough to remember my feelings particularly. But maybe I do dislike or did dislike this one more, because I know this one gave me trouble, but I can't exactly remember why. I think it's just like the timing of his movements just seemed very off for me to parry properly, and I performed way better against this boss when I gave up parrying a bit and would just dodge underneath his left arm and then start attacking him with a charge. So that was like probably one of the hints that I should have taken and moved like it took moving forward from that boss fight, but I just kind of didn't. I still tried to rely way too much on parrying, and I think part of the reason for that is because there's so many like boss attacks that are fury attacks, and so it's like, well, you're gonna have to parry at some point, so you might as well practice on the attacks that don't really matter, and that probably just took me way longer to deal with in the long run.
To understand what I'm saying and keep all of this in mind as you play, this game is still hard. It's not just hard because of the qualities I described, it's just hard. If you're the type of guy that plays Elden Ring and he doesn't use summons, he doesn't use the Ash summons, you play a melee-focused build, and you avoid the internet so as to not spoil yourself or get unduly overpowered,
why you gotta call me out like this?
It's still gonna be hard for that person. And this, I think, is gonna be the most contentious issue for this game. I've seen a lot of people bemoan its difficulty. But I don't think it's unfair, I just think it's not targeted towards the average player. On the bosses I got stuck, I got really stuck. There were at least several times where I would get to a boss, get stuck, and spend the next 3 hours learning its attack timings in order to get through it. And the game is extremely linear, there aren't other paths for you to explore down if you get stuck in a location. Even the most linear of Souls games would give you another path to go down if you're struggling on the path you're on. In Lies of P, your option is get good, and that's pretty much it. The thing is, I don't mind getting stuck on a boss and spending 3 hours on that boss. I like that. I like that provided that the boss is good and I think it's fair, if I notice why I'm losing and can recognize it as my own fault. It's easy to make a game difficult. It's not so easy to make a game difficult and still feel fair. But Lies of P, I think, did exactly that. And so I was perfectly satisfied to run back to the boss and keep learning its pattern until I won.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair and a very good point to bring up as well. There's really only one time I was considering summoning for a boss, and that was Swampy, because the first time I got to phase 2, he one-shot me because of like essentially was kind of equivalent to a bug, which, I mean, it's not really a bug, it's just kind of like an unfortunate set of circumstances. But I was like, there is no way that I'm going to deal with all that bullcrap in phase 1 if this dude can just straight up one-shot me in phase 2. And to be fair, I was considering summoning for Luxasia if there was actually going to be a third phase, just because I didn't want to spend all the extra time going through phase 1 and phase 2, only to potentially see a tiny fraction of phase 3, which doesn't exist, and have to learn more about that. But I'm also the type of person where I would deliberately have my summon killed before going into phase 3, just so that way it would just be like a time saver, essentially. Like, sure, it's a little bit of cheating, but in my mind, like, I know if I can get to phase 3 on my own, I'm kind of fine with just kind of using a little bit of a shortcuts, you know? But I probably would not have done it with like a full set of health heals. I probably would have used some too, just to make it still challenging to me personally. And of course, that's just me. And I could have made this game way, way, way easier on myself if I used the summons at all. But anyway, I still enjoyed myself. Sorry for annoying the chat a bit with my stubbornness, but I did try to warn you guys before we started that playthrough. Teen Set doesn't remember the Archbishop because you found him really easy. It was really like the angel side and the timing of like when he would drop down. Like, he looked so slow, and then the actual drops would happen really quickly that it was just really difficult for me to read when the attacks were coming, which is kind of a consistent issue that I've had with only a couple of the bosses in the game. Elliot says, you think the floor and the average of Lies of P is more difficult, but it doesn't go as high. There's no Millennia or Orphan of Kos here, nor you had to sink as many attempts as some from bosses. Yeah, that's probably a good way to say it. It's like, obviously, I got a bit stuck on Hercules. He was the one that took me the longest, and I think it really only took me 3 hours of fighting him, which is, you know, really not bad. It's probably shorter than a lot of folks, but yeah. I wouldn't be able to summon for phase 3 because summons usually die in phase 1. See, I didn't even know that. But I mean, I figured like if there was a summon, I could be way more aggressive or more selective with the types of attacks that I would dish out to the boss. And it would be really quick to get to phase 2 at the very least. And if it died in phase 2, that'd be perfectly fine with me. Which one was Andreas? Oh, this dude? Okay, yeah. You beat both of those on your first try. I think these were actually easier bosses. I feel like this one is a little bit difficult, but that's like a timing thing. Hey, Elden Enthusiast, welcome back.
The problem is that not everybody is used to this, and they may not have the patience or inclination to lose this much this often every time a new boss rears its ugly head. Getting stuck on bosses is not a new experience for Souls players, but there's not this expectation that it's happening all the time. There are really difficult bosses like Malekith, Melania, that are probably going to have a lot of people running back to them over and over. You know, these bosses have high enough HP, they do enough damage, their movesets are complicated enough that they demand you understand them before you beat them. But that's not going to be the case for every random boss in a mini-dungeon. And it's not even true for all of the rune bearers that you have to defeat. No, sometimes, a lot of the times, the game just gives you a break, and you can beat a boss or several bosses in succession your first try or your first few tries without much difficulty. And Lies of P does that too. There are bosses that are significantly easier than other bosses that you fight. But there's a big difference in the degree. Even a lot of the easier bosses required a decent amount of tries. You know, if I get to a new boss and I beat him anywhere between my first and my 10th try, well, that's an easy boss. That's a cause for celebration. While I was playing, I couldn't help shake the feeling that this wasn't really targeting the average Souls player. I think I'm pretty good at Souls games, and I like losing. I like memorizing enemy patterns. I like getting stuck at bosses for 3 hours. I tolerate that experience very well. And I have to assume that many Souls veterans had a much worse time with these bosses for a lot longer than I did, and they may not enjoy the process of learning these movesets as much as I do. The question is the difficulty fair? Is it bullshit? Is it too much? And I think the right answer is it depends. Fans of the game will say, I'm sure, that Lies of P is hard but fair, completely fair. And they'll say this because the boss's attack patterns can all be parried. You can learn to dodge at the right time, you can position yourself better. The bosses are doable. And once you get a...
Hold on. You could always summon a specter. I feel that right there. Even Rat is getting the comments, as is tradition. Scallies said part of the reason they dropped Sekiro was that they got tired of having to stop and spend hours learning a new boss, while Liza P kept you engaged the entire time, except pre-patched Be Right Back. Screw those guys. The Black Rabbit Brigade. Okay, yeah, that one's kind of understandable. Yeah, my issue with the Black Rabbit Brigade, at least the first time going through, was just not really expecting the speed of the older brother and having to manage him. It's kind of funny, like, how the second iteration of that fight was a lot more manageable for me than the first one.
Accustomed to the game's tempo, you're better able to intuit the boss's attack timings. And all of those things are true, but it doesn't change the fact that I spent an hour on the first difficult boss and around 2 on the second difficult boss.
Oh, so you said when the nameless puppet, the stargazer nearby, gave the option to give your heart, just to taunt me that I could always give up? I was wondering why you guys kept saying you could always give up. I'm like, yeah, okay. I don't think I ever paid attention to that.
And I know for a fact, not everybody wants to do that. Not everyone wants to spend an hour on the same boss while they slowly learn to deal with its moves. And even some of the people that do want to do that don't want to do it this often. So while I do think that the game and the bosses are fair, I suspect that there's a lot of the average FromSoft player base that would disagree, and they're not interested in engaging in this kind of fairness.
I'm a little bit curious when this review got released, because October 19th, so pretty much right when the game released. Because I really haven't heard a lot of the complaints from the people that Ratatoskr is talking about, although I might not be hanging around in the same circles to hear those complaints to begin with. So I think in general, Liza P must have been a bit more well regarded than you may have anticipated. But I do think like a lot of these criticisms were very valid to bring up, especially for those folks who would use ranged build and summon or rely on summons, because that is less of a thing in Liza P. Maybe the summon thing is like, you know, relatively comparable, but I don't really know.
The art style and atmosphere of Liza P have been compared to Bloodborne. And with good reason, it is like Bloodborne. It is trying to be like Bloodborne. Even the story is a little bit like Bloodborne, but that's okay because it does a good job at being Bloodborne. The game takes place in the city of Krat. Krat is a city characterized by the economic prosperity and technological innovations brought about through Ergo and the creation of puppets. These puppets were ubiquitous in the city, which made them all the more devastating when they frenzied, attacking every human in sight. You play as Pinocchio, a special puppet unaffected by the frenzy with the human ability to lie. The atmosphere cultivated by Liza P is top tier. The city is marred by the destruction of the frenzy, but you can still see the greatness and beauty and pride that it had before. Frenzied puppets wander the streets looking for new victims. The surviving human stalkers fight back against the puppets and decorate areas with puppet corpses. The city of Krat is really, really gorgeous, and it's surprisingly varied even though it's still within the city. There's metro stations, city streets, central plazas, industrial factories, opera houses, arcades, exhibition galleries, and even swamps and town outskirts. Exploration exists, but it's linear. The game is very linear. You can explore within the levels, and it's worthwhile to do so. The levels are well designed, and they do weave back into each other, letting you open up checkpoints to avoid previously explored sections. But these checkpoints are still very focused. They're just checkpoints for that level. There's never a situation where you can go on an obscure path that will lead to a different area of the game. You tackle this game one level at a time, and if you're stuck at a boss, you don't really have the option to go elsewhere. I didn't really see the lack of exploration as a problem. To make up for it, the game's levels are just well crafted. The experience is very focused and it keeps you moving forward. There's a low amount of stargazers in each level, but there's a good amount of checkpoints smartly placed that let you get back to those stargazers easily. The storytelling in Liza P takes its cues from Sekiro. In Sekiro, the story is told more overtly than typical for a From Software title. It just tells you what's going on. But there's also a lot there for people that want to look into it and dig. Lies of P takes the same approach, trying to capture the best of both worlds, which was a very good decision in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier in the video, one of my pet peeves with Souls-likes is that they make their stories obscure, but rarely manage to make their stories worthwhile. They rarely warrant the obscurity. The story in Lies of P is direct, it's easy to understand, you know who you're fighting against, you know what characters are what. But beneath that, it's also infused with symbolism and metaphor. Really good symbolism and metaphor. To the point that I'll probably make a lore video on it very soon. A highlight in Lies of P is the music and the sound design. The boss music is really good, so is the environmental effects. Things like rain and wind, footsteps on cobblestones. They're always very noticeable, as is the sound effects of attacks.
Stella says the low amount of stargazers makes it sound like more got patched in later, since everyone here was saying there was a lot. I don't know if everyone was saying that. I know I was saying that a lot, that there was many that I was surprised encountering, but maybe they did add in more. Who knows? Actually, who does know? Scowleasy?
Blocking and perfect blocking especially have a very satisfying clang to them. There's no environmental music most of the time, but there are areas where music is played in the world through speakers, and it contributes wonderfully to the atmosphere of the game. The voice acting is hit or miss, but more hit than miss. What I find most impressive...
So this is something that I kind of wanted to bring up, so I'm glad he brought it up now, because I might have forgotten to do it if it didn't get brought back up to my attention. So anyway, I want to hear what he has to say, then I'll offer my feedback on the voice acting.
Impressive about Lies of P is that this is the Korean studio that made its first attempt at making a Souls-like, and I think it's their second game they've made ever. And they came out swinging. It has an amazing...
Okay, so as for the voice acting, I didn't really mind it. However, there was one voice actor who I felt really didn't fit their character, or I felt as though the character could have been better served with a different voice actor. And this will probably be a little bit of a controversial, hot, spicy take, but I was not a fan of Geppetto's voice actor. Not necessarily like the voice actor. I just felt like his voice didn't... If Geppetto came across as like a kind, warm old man, like a pretty like stereotypical Geppetto, like a Disney style Geppetto, I think that would have been a lot more useful in trying to cater people more towards like the bad ending. And of course that might not have been the vibe that they were trying to work for at all, but I felt like the game would have been more interesting to me, and Geppetto would have been a more interesting character if he was a lot warmer and approachable than he ended up being. Like the first time I heard him talk, I was like, oh man, this dude got like the villain vibes going on, and like I never really shook those, so it was very easy to remain distrustful of Geppetto, which might be what they were going for, but I would have liked a little bit more deception in Lies of P, I guess. He sounds very sinister from the beginning. Okay. You think they made him intentionally uncomfortable sounding? Yeah, I do too. I just think, yeah.
Amazing amount of detail, polish, and quality. It has few bugs, it has great performance, a huge attention to detail, good story, good lore, great combat. No Souls-like has ever scratched the From Software itch for me, and Lies of P did it easily. I believe it represents the beginning of a new golden age for these types of games. The developers that make Souls-likes are finally understanding what it is that made Dark Souls good, and I predict that from here on out, Souls-likes will be closer to the mark and of a higher quality. And that's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.
He didn't tell us to unsubscribe and not like it.
I don't...
Anyway, I really did enjoy this video by him. I'm kind of surprised it has this many dislikes, to be honest. So let's go ahead and link it in chat for you guys. I forgot to point out that I linked the other video in chat when I did. So anyway, that was Ratatoskr's Lies of P is the best Souls-like if you like to lose. I think this is a very measured review of the game. Brought up a lot of fair criticisms, which I, generally agree with. And it is also a little bit vindicating to hear that he got stuck on a couple bosses for like 3 hours at a time. It didn't happen to me too often. It was only the one where I was actually stuck for 3 hours, but actually maybe Luxasia was close because that got split up into 2 streams. No, because I beat her within the first hour. So I spent like 2 hours on her. So I spent like 3 hours on Hercules, 2 hours on Luxasia, 2 hours more on Raiden. And then I don't remember how much for the Archbishop dude. I can see downvotes, but that's because I have a plugin which allows me to do it. And these are like downvotes from people who may allegedly also have the plugin. I don't exactly know how it works. So, yeah. From Carlo's backstory, it's pretty evident Geppetto really doesn't really care about his son, so maybe he's just trying to imitate a concerned father that he's never actually been. Yeah, that's definitely part of it, but I feel like I would have liked it a bit more if he was more convincingly concerned about Carlo, I suppose. All right, so that was another good video by Ratatoskr. Now we'll go ahead and transition. Maybe I shouldn't watch this one tonight because I don't have like a lot of time, and I've been reacting longer than I think I am going to. So, I could do this one tomorrow and then like transition into more Elden Ring type stuff. All right, I'll switch the Pinocchio's a story about art and God for now, and instead do Maximilian dudes. Yeah, it's that good. Max reviews Lies of P.
Let's go! Here's my personal review. I absolutely adore this game. I loved it. And I was constantly surprised that it kept getting better and better and better. Every single time I finished a stream session for this game, I was kind of blown away. And I missed a ton of stuff, right? I missed so much throughout my playthrough. And I was trying to go out of my way to look for things too. And there's just a ton of secrets for replayability. It's got a ton of replayability with choices, right? Let's talk about the basic stuff, which is like story. It's a bit easier to follow than traditional FromSoft, but there's still a lot of like mystery all over the place. It's all over the place. There's still a healthy amount of just like, what is going on? How is this happening? The way...
Yeah, and I think one reason why this works very well with Lies of P especially is because you're a literal puppet. You're just kind of woken up with no explanation as to where you are or why you are where you are. That's the same question, isn't it? Anyway, whereas a lot of games don't necessarily have the same freedom to do that with the way that they structure their stories. Dark Souls and whatnot kind of get away with it, but it's kind of all contrived anyway. But this one actually feels a bit more diegetic and thematic to the story as to why you're like not in the loop of things, because you're essentially not really of this world. You're just kind of something extra and added to it. And with that kind of perspective inherently implied within the game, it's incumbent upon you to kind of not only place where like you are in the world, but also to figure out why you are in the world, which is kind of a very interesting question that doesn't get brought up to the same degree in some other games. To some extent, the FromSoft games do like raise those questions somewhat, especially with like Elden Ring and The Tarnished especially. But yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of a different take on things. And also with it being like a play on Pinocchio, there's a kind of set of expectations that can get subverted by having a different twist on things here. And so I don't necessarily know a lot about Pinocchio, so I am really curious as to watch Jacob Geller's video on that. But like I said a moment ago, I just don't think there's enough time for me to really like sink my teeth into that one tonight. Scaleezy says, You've said it before, but Lies of P is that watershed moment in a genre where an imitator makes something that's on par with the original Trailblazer. Yeah, I feel like even though Lords of the Fallen has problems, between this game and Lords of the Fallen, I think it does become a kind of watershed where the imitators are slowly but surely catching up to the original and are showing hints of the potential to kind of surpass it, or at least take things in a different direction and actually be innovative in the genre. So this is very exciting moving forward, because, you know, FromSoft does switch up their formula from time to time, and with them doing more things like Armored Core, they might not want to make Dark Souls 4 or Elden Ring 2. So it's nice that there might be other developers stepping in to take on that role for themselves. Stella says, your guess is that it's probably less the VA with Morgat and more direction choices. I feel like it's a little bit of both, because it was like the direction choice to cast him in that role. And while I think as an actor, he's perfectly fine, and the way that he delivered the line were fine, they just were a bit more cold and calculated, and didn't give off the kind of warmth I would have preferred Geppetto have if he's just trying to literally use the puppet and whatnot. He's not a very good manipulator, believe it or not. Although maybe that's just kind of part of his arm, so to speak.
The way it exposes it to you, there's just so much to it, and a lot of really great character development and stuff. For people that like are a little turned off by like the Elden Ring and FromSoft style storytelling, I feel like it's a pretty good in between. And also, it's like, it's a Pinocchio, you know, it's something that you all know about, and all it really does is just give me like crazy hope of where they can go and what they could do. And I don't want to like obviously spoil anything right here, but there's just so many different directions that they could go with this shit. So gameplay stuff, dude, weapons, like the game is nuts. There's a billion things you can do with replayability on the weapons. Like, it's wild. So you get, like, obviously the boss weapons have their own practical unique movesets. Maybe not entirely, but the majority of them are pretty crazy unique. And then you have the handles for the weapons that are actually different movesets. And then the modifiers for the handles, which are like the heads of the weapons that change kind of like the abilities they have. So there's just a ton of things. Like, the variety is crazy.
Yeah, I feel like I should have used the Fable arts more than I did. I guess, I mean, part of that is because I was mostly using like the buff ones, because I generally stuck to the elemental ones. And then, honestly, I felt like the 7 explosions for the 7 coil spring sword, it was just kind of okay. It didn't do enough damage where I felt like it was really worth using on a boss over something like a couple smaller attacks in quick succession or a couple charged attacks, because I don't know, I was a little bit incentivized to keep my Fable up if I wanted to use the Aegis and use like the guard parry, or even like the guard parry of this one, even though I never did. I was really bad at using like the L1 triangle type effects, just because it was a little bit awkward, and I didn't really have a strong enough incentive to use it with the weapons that I was using. So anyway, towards the end of the game, I was buffing a bit more consistently, but I didn't really use a lot of the crazier special attacks. So if I do play through the game again, maybe that might be something I'll focus on.
I tried to get a bunch. I'm missing a lot. I really am. There's no ranged weapons, but there is a ton of throwable items. And I later found out that, yeah, the throwable items are kind of nuts. Believe it or not, this game gives you a lot of resources to kill the enemy. Almost too much to a certain degree.
I can kind of agree with that. I felt like at the very beginning, it was kind of reckless to use some of these consumables, especially against the dudes that were like chilling out on the rooftops, even though I really wanted to use my consumables against them. But I'm sure I could have cheesed the hell out of a lot more bosses by using like the little pool type consumables as well as more of the throwables, because when I did use them, they were pretty effective, because a lot of the bosses like to press the attack and kind of like stay close to the character. But like I had mentioned many times throughout the stream, I'm just a little bit stubborn and like to fight them a bit more directly. So that's why I elected to not make life easier on myself. So Teen Sith brought up a good point, is that Geppetto's delivery is like he's talking to a much younger child than the teen P is, because he's assuming that P is not as cognizant or smart as a human. Yes. And that is something that I also picked up on, like saying like you're a good boy, and then like panning the camera over to Carlo when he looks like he's, you know, like 17 or something. It's just kind of a condescending, or it didn't really match the type of conversation like a person has with somebody that looks like Carlo, you know? So there's definitely an imbalance that was present within their relationship from the very beginning of the game. So some of it is definitely dialogue and direction. Some of it is VA, and maybe just like all of it. So that's kind of why I get the vibe that it was all kind of deliberate that they chose Geppetto's voice actor the way that they did. Because, I mean, there's no way that choosing any voice actor isn't a deliberate process. Don't get me wrong, but anyway, I don't want to keep eating that dead horse. Astanex wonders why he even bothers trying to revive Carlo. A lot of work for someone he threw away. And as Teen Seth says, power and control, his own self-image. He's a very, very well-written, abusive parent. And Stella says because he was insane. I feel like saying insane kind of devalues it and sweeps some of those really human characteristics under the rug and makes it a little bit harder to parse and deal with in the future, or like deal with like that type of individual in real life. And I'm not like saying that to criticize what you're like saying specifically, but there are certainly people like that who want a high degree of control over themselves and others. And in many ways, Geppetto's actions can be realistic if you've ever met an individual kind of like them. And in many ways, he could also be compared to like Dr. Victor Frankenstein because of their lack of respect of other people's boundaries, or even more broadly speaking, life's boundaries. And so that's kind of a messed up thing. And so if you think about Geppetto making a puppet to begin with, you kind of have to operate from the viewpoint of somebody who doesn't respect life's boundaries. And so if Geppetto doesn't respect life's boundaries, why the hell would he respect his son's boundaries? You know, it kind of fits part and parcel within his overall character scheme, in my opinion. Elliot says he put his dead wife's soul in a maid robot, then handed her over to be dissected by alchemists when she wakes up to herself. Yeah, absolute stable behavior there. Scalise says there's no confirmation that happened other than having the same name. Okay. All right, going back to the video.
Well, that's cool. There's just so many things you can do between the Fable arts. I probably didn't even see all of them, you know? And it's not even including the puppet arms, which I stuck with puppet string because the final attack for it is crazy, but you could do an entire playthrough with like the shield one or any of these other things and just drastically changes stuff, like dramatically changes what you do. You don't realize it, but they give you so many of these things, right? They give you so much of this stuff throughout the playthrough, where if you want to reload these things, that you just get a ton of it. Like
Yeah, and that's probably something that I should have done a bit more as well. Pretty much the only time I used the Fable condensers, or whatever they're called, is when I was trying to use the glaive form of the Joan of Arc sword. And, oh well.
So much fun. And then you start realizing, oh, this is how much
You're liking this video for him using Proof of Humanity, the final weapon from the portrait that I failed to get? Was it human enough?
freedom I have. It's so sick too. Like there's so many options to beat ass in this game. And I had a couple of moments where it was like, oh, I'm utilizing the mechanics and I am whooping butt now, dude. This is crazy cool. And I started utilizing that all the way to the final fights. Speaking of the fights, so this game is like, you know, the majority of it is bosses. How epic and how crazy are the bosses? And I can only think of one boss that I thought was mostly gimmicky and not that great. And it's the Door Guardian. The Door Guardian is kind of like a mini boss too. Even that is like kind of a minor boss. Door Guardian just kind of sucks. But everything else, every other fight, I'm like, okay, this is kind of frustrating and lame, but then you learn something and you're like, oh.
So, well, I didn't have like the biggest troubles with the Door Guardian. I didn't really mind it too much as a boss. I mind when like there's a couple gimmick fights here and there, but I felt like the presentation of him being a gimmick fight could have been a little bit clearer, but I guess it doesn't really matter. I thought the gimmick was something else than it initially was, because I was like trying to peel off the armor that was on his body. Which, you know, I mean, that's not like the biggest of deals. I figured it out eventually, right? So, okay.
Oh, it's not that bad. Oh, I can do this. Oh, I can. Every single fight was like that. I was kind of blown away. And some of them were sort of like simple. Hour long later, like some hour and 15-minute boss, it just felt perfect. Where you just nail this shit and just destroy it. I was like, oh my God. I think I just adored every single boss fight, to the point where I don't think any of the others FromSoft-like games, the Souls-likes that I've played, get boss fights as right as this. I think even
Yeah, and I think Lies of P had much better boss fights than Lords of the Fallen, but Lords of the Fallen did have a couple pretty good boss fights, but a lot of them were pretty mediocre or kind of subpar. So I think some of the better boss fights for Lords of the Fallen was Pietà, who's kind of like almost the tutorial boss, unfortunately. Then the Light Reaper was pretty good. Well, yes, but no. Like I guess the time when you're like technically supposed to finally fight the Light Reaper, he kind of becomes a pushover because you kind of overlevel him. But my first time playing through the game, I was stubborn, and because I was on PC, I was abusing save states. And so I wanted to fight the Light Reaper the second time I encountered him, because he seemed very like challenging, but like doable at that point without being ridiculously tedious. So I just kind of wanted to do it because it seemed fun. So I kind of did it, and that kind of like bricked to part of my progress, which is kind of dumb as hell, but anyway, not too important. That was a pretty good boss fight. Elian the Starved was also pretty good. The Judge Cleric was actually a good fight. So that's pretty much it, though. They don't really have like a ton of really big main bosses that are really good. It's just a bunch of like mini bosses that get reused. So I do wish Lords of the Fallen had a bit more enemy variety in the grand scheme of things, whereas I felt like Lies of P did not have those issues whatsoever. The bosses were pretty distinct from all of the other bosses, and they were pretty challenging and appropriately challenging for each section of the game, I think. Stubborn is definitely a key word for me. Get it from my grandpa. Second only to Outastam, indeed.
I think this game has better boss fights than Dark Souls 1, if not Demon Souls. I think it does a better job than...
Oh yeah, definitely way better than Demon Souls especially, and I think Dark Souls 1. Yeah, honestly, I feel like the bosses in Dark Souls 1 are very clunky and clumsy and not that great, and I will stand by that statement even for like everybody's favorite being Artorias and Manus. I feel like serviceable. Ornstein and Smo are functional. Like that's kind of pretty much what I can say about most of the Dark Souls bosses. They're functional, but only Artorias and Manus feel like decent to me in Dark Souls 1. Maybe there's another one somewhere. Let me do some mental mapping out. I guess like you could argue the Taurus demon or the Asylum demons. Although they were kind of ass until the remaster where you could actually see the AoE effect of their attacks. And then the issue is they get just reused too much with the Demon Fire Sage essentially being the same thing. Anyway, that's not too important. The bosses in Lies of P were much, much, much better than I was expecting, to be honest. I was kind of shocked by them, to be honest. You think Quelaag is brought up a lot by people, though? You think that might be the hot lady effect. As a good boss, honestly, Quelaag was my very first like disappointment of a boss for Dark Souls 1 because I beat her my first try, which was a very bittersweet experience for me because I was not very good at that game at all at that point when I was playing it. And so, like, always my goal of non-goals in that game was to like beat a boss on the first try. And then I fought Quelaag and did it. And then I was really just surprised to discover that I was disappointed that the fight wasn't more difficult. So it's like, wait, I got what I wanted. Or it's like the Wario meme says, I won. At what cost, you know? Stella says she's not completely terrible, but definitely a hot lady effect. Absolutely. No, I was not using the Drake sword. I was using the halberd because I was bad. Scaleezy says the hardest part of DS1 is holding back from getting a plus 15 weapon before Anor Londo. So like I said, my first time playing through the game, I was really bad. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. So I was just trying to use everything that I encountered, which is like pretty much tradition. So my stats were all over the place. I was trying to use like crystal weapons at one point. I had the halberd. I had some weird ass buff. I would need to like look back at my Prepare to Die edition character because I haven't touched it. But anyway, yeah. Epic Name Bro said his first maxed out piece of equipment in Dark Souls 1 was leather armor. Oh my god, that reminds me. So when I went back to play Dark Souls 1 and go for my platinum trophy, I upgraded all of my equipment, and then I was really shocked when I upgraded my Zweihander to max that I got the achievement for it. I was like, what the hell? I'd never even got a max weapon, but I beat the game before. How is this even possible? So it's because I think I was using a raw weapon on my like first character. I would have to double check, but yeah. Kind of embarrassing like looking back, but I mean eventually I figured out like how the stats and everything worked and how like it's kind of really, really bad to try to allocate points into different things to try things out. You just kind of want to min-max one thing and roll with it. So yeah, just kind of forgot about all that, to be honest.
Then even some of the early FromSoft games, this is definitely a better job than Dark Souls 2. That's the crazy part, is that I think Lies of P is directly comparable to FromSoft games. And I think that's probably the biggest review the most glowing review I can give it, which is what...
Yeah, I think that's fair, although I don't know how fair it is to compare it to Dark Souls 1 and 2 and Demon Souls specifically. I feel like those are kind of like the relics of a bygone era before they really greased the wheel. And so I think I'm trying to compare Lies of P to Dark Souls 3 because I feel like the Bloodborne comparisons are obvious. And I know early in the stream I said I think I like Dark Souls 3 more than Lies of P, but I think that's just like the feel of Dark Souls 3 in terms of the movement and whatnot. But generally speaking, Lies of P has a lot of quality of life features going for it that are completely absent in the earlier FromSoft games. So it's kind of difficult to compare the two because, well, I like the fluidity of the motion more in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, Lies of P also has this really innovative weapon crafting system, which there's absolutely nothing in the FromSoft catalog which really compares with it. So it's just kind of like a little bit of apples and oranges. But I think the real deciding factor for me at that point would be that I like the level design in Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne a lot more than Lies of P, which, to put in perspective, like the level design in Lies of P is actually really good and very, very serviceable, but it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't quite have that same feel as the FromSoft games. And as like Teen Sith said on stream like earlier in the week or last week or whatever it was, that Lies of P tends to feel a bit too theme parky, and it's hard for me to take that comment seriously at the time because I was literally in the arcade, which is kind of like a literal carnival. So it's like, oh, you say that this game feels like a theme park when I'm in the equivalent of a theme park. You said, So anyway, after going through the rest of the game, I kind of get what she was saying, where it's just very kind of linear and on the rails. Whereas the FromSoft games, while they are actually very linear and on the rails, they do kind of a better job of hiding it and allowing more branching side paths that connect into the rest of the level in more varied and interesting ways, which Lies of P just doesn't quite have down just yet. You had no idea it was topical to me? Okay. Chadwick says, FromSoft is a dev team of dungeon makers. They want you to scrounge around and look everywhere. Lies of P was like a Super Nintendo game. Get to the end of the area with a couple of jaunts along the way. Yeah, that's a pretty good way of describing it too. Which is kind of interesting because like there are definitely aspects of the city of Krat which seem pretty good and like kind of like true to life in terms of have like city plazas and streets and like the metro station and whatnot, which I enjoyed. But like other parts just felt a bit too theme parky, shall we say? Which, I mean, this like wasn't necessarily bad, but it left me wishing there was a little bit more around a corner here or there.
What I said several times over, this is not a Souls-like. It's a Souls game. It just is. So much of it is just so directly like one-to-one with their design philosophy that all these other developers have tried for the past 10 years to get this right. And a lot of games have come very close and taken these elements. This just feels like FromSoft made a Pinocchio game. They get it. They just didn't take the things that they did. Like, we're going to try, right? We're just going to make our game really obtuse and really, not direct storytelling. We're going to make our combat really weighty and heavy. Like, all the things that you think make FromSoft games, right? No. Like, they kind of get it. And even the level design to a degree is super good. I think the only thing that was sort of lacking in some places was maybe like the voice acting. But just talking about like combat and what you can do, it has that FromSoft feeling where it's like I could see myself going through this game several different ways and just having it be the way it is and playing it a completely different way.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the greatest strengths of Lies of P is that the weapons all feel very, very different from each other, despite, like the blade bits. The handles all feel very different from each other. And that's a very exciting thing, and it facilitates a kind of freedom in a very linear game, which I think even FromSoft doesn't do the best at sometimes. And what I mean by that is part of the reasons I fell off Sekiro as hard as I did was because not only did it have a linear story, but its gameplay was also extremely linear, whereas Lies of P has a very linear story and level design, but its weapon design and combat is much less linear, and I can enjoy it a multitude of ways. And so in some ways, I think Lies of P might unironically have more replay value to me than Sekiro, even though I would say that Sekiro's combat system is a lot more heavily polished than this game. And this kind of ties back into one of the comments that I was making on my video where I was like criticizing the Call of Duty devs that were pooping on God of War not having a lot of player engagement after they like beat the game. So well, wanting to invest a lot of time in a game, it can be a good thing. I don't think that's like the end all be all of gaming and game design. And for me, a game that I play for 20 hours and I get my fullest enjoyment that I possibly could out of it isn't necessarily weighted less against a game that I play for 200 hours because the experience is different. Like, while I would like to play Sekiro, or sorry, let me like rephrase this. While I would want to enjoy Sekiro more to the points that I would want to like replay it over and over and over, I don't necessarily have that feeling, but I also don't really lament not having that feeling to a certain degree. Sorry, I kind of like phrased that poorly, but and I kind of contradicted myself a little bit there. I understand that. Let me try to like phrase it a bit better, or look at chat real quick. Microsoft came pretty close with Bloodborne trick weapons with relation to the weapon variety. Yes, but yeah, I was kind of like leaving Bloodborne alone, but in some ways, like a lot of Dark Souls 3's weapons feels very similar, so that's kind of why I was focusing on Sekiro, because that's like the most linear FromSoft game, whereas this one is a very linear game, but I think it's got more replayability for me than Sekiro. So even though I think Sekiro is a better game, I think I would be able to invest more time on Lies of P. Scalzi prefers roleplay through mechanics, so Lies of P having weapons and builds has less replay potential for you? Okay. But does it have more replay potential for you than like Sekiro? So what was I trying to say with the time invested in games? Okay, yeah. So there are certain movies which I've watched once, and I think they're brilliant, amazing movies that I never want to watch again. Requiem for a Dream. You know, like how many how many friends do you have that like want to watch Requiem for a Dream every weekend? None. You know, like there's a kind of sense to having a complete experience on an initial playthrough. And I think that is a valuable, or maybe like an undervalued part of gaming, where there's kind of always this expectation that you need to get like 40 to 50 hours out of a game, bare minimum, to like say, oh, this is like the money, versus wanting to invest 400 to 500 hours or 5,000 hours into a game that you just kind of like fall in love with, and that's kind of like your game that you go with. I feel like there should be more appreciation for those types of games where they're just really good at what they do, but they're not necessarily something you invest your life into playing. So maybe this isn't the best example, but like Vampire Survivors, I think is like a perfect game for what it is. It's like, if you're playing Vampire Survivors, you're freaking playing Vampire Survivors. It's probably going to be one of your favorite games if you like that style of game, because it's so good at what it does. It's not one of those games where you need to invest 5,000 hours into it, but you very well could, just because it's that good of a game, you know? Yeah, and just like the whole Requiem for a Dream example is another one that just, I mean, that's not a game, obviously. It's just kind of like the same principle in a different package. Oh yeah, Teen Sith says Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Yeah, that's another good example of a movie where you kind of see once, but you don't necessarily need to keep rewatching it. I'm not sure what VS here. Oh, Vampire Survivors, sorry. Bringing up Vampire Survivors isn't fair that Dev used to design slot machines. Why isn't it fair, though? Like, I mean, really, though, I mean, I'm sure I've spent a decent amount of time in Vampire Survivors. Let me load up my Steam real quick and actually look at my playtime. I probably have like 100 hours, I would assume, maybe a little bit more, because I was playing that a lot when I got COVID. Yeah, Path of Exile is that. No, I feel like Path of Exile is kind of like the opposite example, where that's a game where it kind of wants you to spend 1,000 hours, whereas like Vampire Survivors doesn't really care if you do that. Oh, wow. I was pretty close. So I have, why is it getting stuck? Anyway, what the hell? Anyway, why can't I move things to this monitor sometimes? Okay, so I have 95 hours of Vampire Survivors time, which, I mean, is a decent chunk of a game time for any game, don't get me wrong, but I mean, that's because I was trying to complete the game, so that's like 100 hours to like platinum a game. But I guess they added more achievements. Anyway, not so important. My point is, like, I could quit Vampire Survivors cold turkey whenever I want. I'm not addicted, you're addicted. And it's just kind of like its own perfect experience. Maybe another really good game to compare it to would be Undertale, where it's one of those games where I know like its fan base is definitely rabid, but you don't necessarily need to invest 1,000 hours into that game to get the fullest appreciation that you could out of it. It's kind of like a 30-hour game with like multiple playthroughs and not something that like forces you to keep engaging with it. So sorry for being like on this kind of a soapbox tangent for so long now. Okay, I guess I dropped a couple frames there, so hopefully it's better for you guys now. Thanks for saying something though. All right, going back to the video now.
I love this game, dude. I love it. And it's spooky, and it's creepy, and it's all Atmo, and the art is amazing. And here's the thing. Some people are like, I like this more than Bloodborne. I think this game is better than Bloodborne. You know what? I think that's fair. I think some people having that interpretation of this, it might be better to some people. I get it. Although I don't say that's true for me. Because there's probably, of all the Souls games, it isn't just Bloodborne littered throughout this game. It is not. It's got a lot of Sekiro in it, and it's got a lot of like Dark Souls 3-ish. To be honest, the combat really isn't Bloodborne-like. The way it feels doesn't feel like Bloodborne. It just feels more like Souls. It feels like Dark Souls 3. In the same way that I would say, a lot of people ask me, do you like FF7 Remake more than the original? And I go, well, no, because the original is the original. The original inspired like FF7 Remake to be what it is without.
Oh man, I could get on a completely different soapbox tangent about that, but I will leave that alone. So, for some people enjoying Lies of P more than Bloodborne, I could see it, and I do think it'd be a little bit easier for more people to get into Lies of P than Bloodborne, because I think it's a much more approachable game overall, because, I mean, you wake up in a freaking dilapidated clinic, and you don't even get so much as a slap on the ass, and you're forced to go outside and get your ass kicked by a literal werewolf. And that's like the Bloodborne experience. Whereas Lies of P does guide you a little bit more clearly as to what you're doing. It has a more coherent story and whatnot. It's also got, you know, better quality of life features. You don't need to farm for blood vials and or deal with such excruciatingly long loading screens until Bloodborne PC gets released. JK. Anyway, so this doesn't necessarily surprise me. It does make me a little bit sad, but I mean, Lies of P is a good game, and I know Bloodborne is certainly not for everyone.
Without the original, this game wouldn't be a thing. I wouldn't like this as much. It's the exact same way about Bloodborne. This game wouldn't exist without Bloodborne. None of the other Souls games like integrate all of this storytelling into mechanics, into, you know, items, like all this stuff as much as Bloodborne does. Bloodborne does it just beautifully, where it's just wild. Oh my god, this is so thought through, this is so cool. This game's kind of like that, right? Where it does that same thing in that way, even better than the majority of other FromSoft games. So
I was wondering if I would have enjoyed Lies of P more if rally damage was just a thing and then guarding just kind of reduced the amount of rally damage taken. But I feel like that would have also made the game a lot easier, which I don't know if would be like better or worse. So there's just kind of like one of the random thoughts that I've had throughout the stream that I didn't bring up, and this just kind of reminded me of it right now. Lies of P isn't about infant sacrifice. You're not wrong, are you? Well, maybe you are wrong. At the very least, we know you did not give Geppetto your heart at the end of the game, huh? Elliot says Bloodborne's like 9 years old and has its issues. Oh God, it is almost 9 years old. Don't remind me of that fact ever again. No, I'm just kidding. You're comfy saying you'd rather play Lies of P again than play Bloodborne again in 2024. Is that because you've already played the mess out of Bloodborne? I feel like that could have something to do with it. But I mean, like I said a moment ago, like Bloodborne does have less quality of life features, which definitely can detract from the experience. Lies of P is even faster paced than Bloodborne with how you're constantly weaving blocks in between attacks. I think at times it can be, yes, especially because of the animations and whatnot, but I still feel as though Bloodborne's combat was more aggressive, which is a very different vibe than Lies of P, which is a lot more reactive. And that's kind of one of the quintessential differences between the games, which I guess I haven't really talked about too much yet throughout this stream. So I'm kind of glad you brought it up that way. So that, yeah, that's kind of like one of my complaints about Lies of P, which isn't really a complaint as much as it is a like lamentation. How do you say this in a sentence? Anyway, there were definitely times I wanted to punish the bosses a bit more, but I felt because I was funneled more towards parrying, I wasn't doing that as much as I wanted to. And that's kind of more of a me problem, because once I did start dodging more, I was able to punish more. But it just, yeah, I don't know. I needed to get good, but the way that the game kind of presented what good was not actually what it really was, if that makes any sense. Chadwick says, this is the weird thing about graphics not being generational anymore. It's really easy to ignore nearly a decade of dev and experience between what the Bloodborne dev team knew and what the Lies of P team knows. You wouldn't compare a Super Nintendo game with a PS2 game, but what we're doing here is in terms of like what the world knew when those games existed. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I would definitely compare Super Nintendo games to PlayStation 2 games. I do that quite a lot. I mean, crap. The other day in stream, we were comparing like Mega Man to Dark Souls and whatnot, or like these games. So I still do that to a degree, but I definitely know what you're saying. Like, these games came out at certain times, and it is a little bit unfair to compare the games of old to the games of now. No. Nightbot calling me out. I'm going to wait a second more to see if Chadwick says something else. Otherwise, I'll start the video. He's on the spot now. Think about what gaming devs knew by the time the PS2 came out about game design versus the Super Nintendo guys. So much since has updated since then. No, I definitely agree with that, which is why I don't think it's super fair to compare Lies of P to Bloodborne. But to be fair, why shouldn't we compare Lies of P to Bloodborne? Because it's not as though time stopped existing. That's the wrong way to say it. It's not as though like Lies of P and Bloodborne don't compete against each other now. They do. Like, if you take a rando off the street who's never played a Soulsborne and you asked them to play all of these games and told them to start with Lies of P, they might very well like it more than Bloodborne, and that's a valid thing. And they don't necessarily need to keep in mind the context that like, oh, Bloodborne came out almost 9 years ago at this point. So, well, I do definitely think there is merit to what you say. I also think like a good game should kind of withstand the test of time. And I think even at the time Bloodborne got released, there were certain issues with it. And in many ways, the fundamentals of game design haven't changed that much, because I know a lot of people prefer Dark Souls 1's level design to Bloodborne's, and the 3D space hasn't changed that much in terms of like game dev, as much as it has been like the amount of assets that you can have on screen and like, you know, the pixel slash polygon count, all that kind of stuff. Hey, Jesse R, welcome back to stream. Teen Sith says, maybe the older games shouldn't age so well if we aren't supposed to compare them. Yeah, and Scowleasy says, that's more of a testament to the fact that it's taken 9 years to make something that rivals Bloodborne. If Bloodborne had a bit of a frame rate visual bump and a non-farmed heal item, that would be enough to get it up to par with current gen. I would go one step further and say if they also adjusted like either the blood gems or consumables in general, but yeah, I would definitely agree with that. If you got rid of the blood vial farming in Bloodborne and it got, you know, remastered, it could still very well hold its own in today's market. Just stop comparing the derivative work to its inspiration, maybe, but I don't know. I think it's still fair. I mean, at one point, or sorry, not one point. At what point does the imitator become the genuine article, you know? When does the Zelda clone outperform Zelda? That's kind of a loaded question because, like, we still haven't really had the... Actually, let's ask ourselves that. Has there been... Okay, maybe Pal World... Sorry, I didn't answer... Sorry, I didn't ask my question for you guys to be able to answer it. I just started to answer it. So... Has there ever really been a game imitator that has knocked out the game that it was imitating and then became like the flagship for that kind of genre? Maybe Metroid, Castlevania. Let me think. I think like other than Dark Souls, like really knocking out like the platformer, although it didn't really have what all did Dark Souls compete with like Demon Souls, and I don't know. Oh, actually, yeah, maybe Smash Brothers could be an example of that. Oh, okay, no, Scala has it. Halo overtaking Doom clones, or like Half-Life 2, really. Doom had kind of died by the time Half-Life came around. Half-Life 2 kind of like revolutionized all FPSs, and then Halo took it to the next level, and then COD took over Halo, and then arguably Battlefield took over COD, and it's kind of like they all got overshadowed by Fortnite. So yeah, those are pretty good examples there. Bloodstained is a good improvement on Castlevania. Okami is a better game than Zelda, but it didn't displace it. Yeah. Sonic was more popular than Mario for a while, but it didn't last forever. I would disagree with that. I think there was a little bit more hype around Sonic for a time, but I would disagree that he ever actually truly dethroned Mario. And if so, I think it was a very, very fleeting moment. So Scowleys says Hollow Knight. I might be more inclined to agree if like Silk Song came out and kind of like still revolutionized the whole industry further, but it's still kind of derivative of Metroidvanias, and people don't say like it's a Hollow Knight like. Well, obviously Hollow Knight has become a standard for which to compare other Metroidvanias. I don't think it's quite at that level yet. So anyway, how did we get to this tangent? Just old games outperforming new games. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of my point where I think it is fair to compare Lies of P and Bloodborne to each other as they are right now. And so I honestly don't know whether or not like how you can justify one game being better than the other, because they just kind of do different things better in different ways. So I think it's just kind of like personal preference. No, you're fine. You don't need to apologize. I just was trying to like figure out how we got to this point in case I wanted to touch back onto something earlier in the conversation. Okay, going back to the video, and thanks for all the discussion, guys.
The fact that these developers understood that is just what gets me the most about this. The whole lying thing and developing your character. It's like I said, it's missing a character creator, which is the one thing that makes FromSoft games or Souls games kind of like Souls games. It's missing a character creator. And I feel like that's something that these games probably are going to be missing. But the development of the character throughout the playthrough I thought was incredibly cool. You start off as like a boy, and then you're a teenager, and you end as a man. I wasn't expecting that shit to happen. There's a lot of Bloodborne in here, but I think that's in design and storytelling beats. Not as much in like direct gameplay. Because there were some areas that like I'm like, dude, we're just in the Nightmare of Mensis right now.
And that's kind of one of the things that was a little bit weird to me playing through Lies of P that I thought about earlier in the stream as well, where there were multiple times on my stream of Lies of P where I was like, oh, this reminds me of this reminds me of that. Whereas when I was playing Lords of the Fallen, I didn't necessarily have those feelings where like, oh, this is, derivative of this. So I did like Lords of the Fallen's level design a lot more than Lies of P. And yeah, I don't know. Like, Lies of P level design wasn't bad, but it just kind of felt derivative, whereas Lords of the Fallen didn't. Sorry if I'm just kind of like repeating myself there.
Oh, we're kind of doing the forest area, and they sort of happen at similar spots. But my God, man, yeah, there's very few areas I really disliked about this game. They just all feel really good to go through. Oh, you know what I got to give them credit for? There's a couple moments in Bloodborne that are sick, where like enemies bust through walls and shit. There's a couple of moments in Bloodborne that are like that, but it doesn't happen all the time. In this game, they try to inject these cool moments of the enemies like manipulating the environment or busting down walls or doing some crazy thing in every single zone and area. And I think that's awesome. The enemies that...
And I have mixed feelings about that because after a while it does get a little bit overused. And the reason why I say it gets overused specifically is because in the final area of the game, there's that one puppet that busts out, or was it a carcass, whatever. One enemy busts out of a wall that literally has no other entrances or exits, so is literally enclosed on all four sides, presumably just chilling there since the dawn of man, waiting for Carlo to come by so he could bust out and jump scare us. So that one felt a little bit over the top, but most of the other ones felt pretty decent and kind of like set up pretty well. I did enjoy the few times where they caught me looking in a different direction, and that caused me to, or like I dropped my guard because I was looking in a different direction rather than like being as vigilant as I perhaps could have been. So when I was going into the fake Patches' hideout in the fake Forbidden Woods, and I was looking at the ceiling instead of the floor, and I fell through it. That was kind of funny to me. There were a couple times where I stepped on bear traps, where I was like looking up or looking at an enemy ahead. Those are pretty decent. So I'm not trying to say like all this was bad, but I do think they kind of overplayed their hand a little bit. And sometimes less is more, because it's just always very memorable to me when the Scourge Beast is going to pop out of the house in Old Yarnum and jump scare the hell out of a bear, because that really only happens a couple of times in Bloodborne. It's just kind of it has a greater shock value as a byproduct of that. It'd be hilarious if the first open world survival Pokemon game gets compared to Palworld. Is that not what Palworld already is? I'm confused. Dead Space is supplanted BioShock, you think, for the sort of survival horror light audio log thing, which they themselves supplanted the System Shock games? I don't know about that, because I just saw a thumbnail from Digital Foundry literally earlier today where a game was compared to BioShock rather than Dead Space. So maybe I didn't like make my point as clear, or maybe it's just kind of misunderstood. But you were kind of right on the money, I think, earlier with pointing out Halo and Doom and or Half-Life, where like the genre gets like redefined by that game, and so like that game kind of is like becomes the gold standard. Whereas I feel like the Dead Space / BioShock thing isn't quite as much of a thing, and it's kind of harder to compare them against each other. So maybe that's just like not a fair comparison on my part. Chadwick wants them to make a Pokemon game you actually want to play. Don't we all? Don't we all?
That you fight interact with the areas like quite a bit and present to you this like, okay, here's this crazy challenge. Here's what they do now. Like, get ready. I honestly think this game is incredibly cool. I give it like an 11 out of 10. I emphatically implore you to play this shit.
And honestly, when people say like 11 out of 10, that just means like, oh, now I can't trust anything this dude says because he has no standards. Like, this is a pretty good video otherwise, like up until this point. It just kind of really defeats the point that they're making. Even so, like, he might not give like a lot of high scores, but 11 out of 10 like breaks the scale. So if your scale is broken, why should I believe it? Is kind of like the vibes that I get.
Even if you don't like traditional FromSoft games, I really, really, really implore you to check this game out. There's a lot to it. It's incredibly fun. It's got great levels. It's got great storytelling. I am being pursued currently.
Elliot says this one goes up to 11. Well, why not just make 10 better?
It's so good. I give it my critical rating is a 10 out of 10. Critically. My personal rating is like an 11. I love it.
If that's a critical rating, I mean, does he literally see no flaws in it? I just can't take stuff like that seriously just because it feels like that's not a critical view. That's just kind of like way more like emotional to me. But I mean, that's kind of like one of the values, I think, of looking at the different reviews that we have so far on stream, just to see where different people are at. So, I think that's pretty much it. Alright, so that was a good video by Maximilian, dude. Obviously, I disagree with the scoring there, but nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead and share it with you guys in the chat if you want to give him some support with a like and or a sub, or even if you want to give me some support with a like and a sub. We've got those stupid little buttons down at the bottom. Calls to action. Anyway, real talk, no game is a 10 out of 10. Yeah, that's generally my stance. There might be a 10 out of 10, but I feel like the standards might be different. And if I were to like give a game a 10 out of 10, it'd be because I think there would be absolutely nothing that could have been improved upon it. And if so, I might reserve that for like one of the prehistoric arcade style games. So maybe something like Space Invaders, because Space Invaders could only have ever been Space Invaders. Like there's nothing nothing better. Oh, Tetris. Tetris to me is like a 10 out of 10 because it's like it's perfect. Like there's very little you could really do to make Tetris better than it already is without adding like more bells and whistles. And you know, that's kind of like its own story. Like not every game of Tetris is like a 10 out of 10. But just like the principle of it is kind of like a 10 out of 10. Hopefully that makes sense. Teen Sith says, the whole idea of having audio logs and text/environmental storytelling was pioneered by System Shock 1. What year did System Shock 1 come out? Because I know, you know, the Bethesda games were doing similar ideas within the Fallout franchise, but they might not have had like fully integrated things. Oh, wow, it's one of those type games, the super old ones. 1994. Okay, you might be right then. But I don't know, because there were like a lot of other mystery games like Syndicate. Maybe that counts. I don't know enough about like that kind of history of gaming, to be honest, to really challenge you. To be fair, where am I? Okay. Tetris lore is mid. How can you say Tetris lore is mid? Can you not possibly appreciate the difference between the S and Z blocks anymore? Or the dreaded T block at the wrong time? It's really like the S or the Z block that's problematic. And then, dare you challenge the greatness of the long and tall block? Elliot would not try to rank your personal 10s against each other. This is just some standout examples of the art. Yeah, so even like one of my favorite games of all time, the original Final Fantasy VII, I would not rate a 10 out of 10 because it does have flaws, but I think for the time that it came out and what it did for gaming is it's actually kind of hard to understate how much of an impact that I think it really did have on gaming as a whole. But that's just kind of like its whole other subject and tangent to go on. But I do think a game that would kind of give Final Fantasy VII a run for its money in terms of like narrative development and whatnot would be Suikoden 2, which, it's like one of the best JRPGs ever made. It's supposed to be getting a remaster later this year, but news about it has kind of died off for a bit. Straight block needs a balance pass, to be honest. It's too OP, needs a nerf. So yeah, like even if you think about it, changing Tetris ever so slightly just would completely change the landscape of the game. Like what if you gave another row, you know? Astanek says, a 10 out of 10 only lasts until something equal or greater comes out. Demon Souls at the time it came out was a 10 out of 10, but then Dark Souls surpassed it in many ways. See, I would completely disagree with that because I feel like even at the time Demon Souls came out, there were a lot of problems with it. And like even for that timeline, like the absolute terrible item economy, the kind of permanent effects of character and world tendencies, things like that are pretty problematic. I feel like that's just a little bit of a personal feelings get involved with Demon Souls. And of course, like, I mean, personal feelings are going to be involved with any game review. There is no objective 10, but that's just kind of going off on a different tangent there. All right. But okay, everybody, that'll be it for tonight's stream. We will be going live again at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I will probably begin tomorrow's stream with Pinocchio is a story about art and God, and then transition back into some more Elden Ring or like Dark Souls lore videos and whatnot. So I'll need to like look through my playlist here and put some things together. So thank you so much for joining me on this stream. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch you on the next one. Last Protagonist out.